The wind never really stopped in Red Hollow. It was a living thing, a restless spirit that scoured the wide, arid valley floor, picking up the alkali dust and flinging it against the weathered siding of the buildings that lined the main street. Even now, with the sun dipping below the jagged line of the western buttes and turning the sky a bruised shade of purple, the grit found its way inside. It coated the display window of the small dressmaker's shop, sifted through the cracks in the doorframe, and settled in the fine creases of Lena Hart's hands as she guided a silver needle through heavy calico. Red Hollow sat on the edge of civilization, or perhaps just beyond it, a cluster of timber and adobe clinging to the railroad tracks that cut through the territory like a scar. It was a town built on cattle and freight, smelling of manure, sawdust, and the metallic tang of dried blood. The boardwalks were splintered and gray, warped by the relentless cycle of blistering heat and freezing high-desert nights. At this hour, the freight wagons were finally rumbling to a halt near the depot, the drivers shouting amidst the groaning of axles and the stamping of exhausted mules. Lena did not look up at the noise. At 26, she had learned that looking up usually invited trouble. She kept her head bent over her work, the oil lamp casting a golden circle of light on the fabric. She was letting out the waist of a Sunday dress for Mrs. Galloway, the banker's wife. It was fine work, tedious and demanding, the kind of labor that made her eyes burn and her fingers cramp. Mrs. Galloway would not thank her for it. Nor would she invite Lena to the church social where the dress would be worn. Lena would be paid in coins that were tossed onto the counter, not placed in her hand, accompanied by a stiff nod that barely acknowledged her humanity. To the town, Lena Hart was a fixture, useful but tainted. She was the widow Hart, the woman whose husband had died in a drunken fall 3 years ago, leaving her with nothing but debts and a reputation that hung over her like the dust clouds. She heard the whispers when she walked to the mercantile. She saw the way the shutters on the houses along Elm Street snapped closed when she passed. Even the children, echoing the poison they heard at dinner tables, would sometimes trail behind her, calling out names she tried hard to pretend she did not hear. She tied off a thread and bit the end, finally setting the fabric down. The silence of the shop pressed in on her. It was a small space, cluttered with bolts of fabric, sturdy wool, cheap gingham, and one bolt of blue silk she had ordered in a fit of optimism and never sold. She lived in 2 cramped rooms behind the curtain at the back, a space that felt less like a home and more like a cell she had constructed for herself. Lena reached up and absent-mindedly touched the hollow of her throat, her fingers grazing a small, faded yellow mark near her collarbone. It was an old bruise, long healed on the surface, but the phantom pain of it remained. It was a souvenir from Thomas, her late husband. He had been a man who believed that fear was the only language a wife should understand. She opened the drawer of her sewing table to put away her shears and paused. In the back corner, tucked behind a box of pins, lay her wedding band. It was gold, or gold-plated, and bent out of shape. She had taken it off the day they buried him and had never put it back on. The metal was cold against her fingertip. She remembered the nights Thomas would come home, smelling of cheap whiskey and stale tobacco. His eyes glazed with a hunger that had nothing to do with love. Obey, the preacher had told her. Reverend Clay, with his stark black coat and eyes like flint, had stood in her parlor when she dared to show him a split lip, and he had told her that a wife's duty was submission. He had told her that her spirit was too willful, that her beauty was a snare, and that she must humble herself to her husband's authority. So she had. She had learned to go still, to lock her mind away in a high tower while her body was used as a vessel for Thomas's rage and lust. She had learned that desire was a weapon men used to break you, and that any answering spark within her own body was a betrayal of her soul. And yet, Lena closed the drawer quickly, the sound loud in the quiet shop. She reached under the counter and pulled out a small, dog-eared book with a lurid cover. It was a dime novel, The Ranger's Vow, bought in secret from a passing peddler. She knew she should not read it. The church elders would call it trash, or worse, an invitation to sin. But she opened it to a marked page, her heart beating a little faster. The passage described a hero with eyes like the storm-tossed sea and a heroine who fainted into his arms, overcome by a passion that burned like fire. Lena read the words, her breath hitching. She hated herself for it. She hated the way her skin pricked with warmth, the way a heavy, aching emptiness settled low in her belly. It was shameful. It was dangerous, but in the safety of the lamplight, with the wind howling outside, she allowed herself to imagine a touch that did not hurt, a hand that held rather than crushed. Outside the sanctuary of the shop, the world was darkening. High on a rise overlooking the town, a lone rider pulled his horse to a halt. Cole Maddox was tired. It was a bone-deep exhaustion that had less to do with the 3 weeks he had spent in the saddle and more to do with the 10 years he had spent running from himself. He shifted his weight, the leather of his saddle creaking. His duster was coated in the same gray dust that blanketed the valley, and his hat was pulled low, shielding a face that life had not been kind to. A pale, jagged scar ran from his left temple down across his cheek to his jawline, a permanent reminder of a knife fight in Abilene. He looked down at the scattered lights of Red Hollow. It looked like every other town he had passed through. A few saloons, a general store, a church spire pointing accusingly at the heavens. He did not want to stop. He wanted to keep riding until he found a place where the sky didn't look so big and empty, where the silence didn't scream at him, but his gelding, a sturdy bay with a white blaze, was favoring its left foreleg, and his own canteen had been dry since noon. He had no choice. Cole rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the grit in his unshaven beard. He closed his eyes for a second, and the image was there, waiting for him. It was always there, the smell of smoke, the crackle of timber burning. The screams of the family trapped inside the sod house while the men he rode with, men he had called friends, sat on their horses and watched. He had been young then, a hired gun for the biggest cattle outfit in the territory, thinking that loyalty was the highest virtue. He had been wrong. He had not lit the fire, but he had not put it out. That failure sat in his chest like a stone that never grew lighter. He had turned his back on that life, walked away from the money and the power, but the ghosts followed him. They rode pillion on his saddle, whispering that he was no better than the men he had left behind. Cole nudged the horse forward, guiding him down the rocky switchback trail toward the lights. He needed whiskey to wash the dust from his throat, and he needed work to fill his pockets. He just hoped he could find both without having to use the heavy Colt Navy revolver that hung at his hip. The main street of Red Hollow was mostly empty, the wind driving people indoors. Cole tied his horse at the rail outside a building that identified itself as the Drover's Rest. The sound of a tinny piano and rough laughter spilled out through the batwing doors. Cole adjusted his gun belt, took a breath of the cooling air, and pushed inside. The saloon was hazy with tobacco smoke. A long mahogany bar ran down one side, crowded with men in rough canvas coats and sweat-stained hats. At the tables, games of faro and poker were in progress. The air smelled of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and tension. Cole walked to the bar, his spurs chiming softly against the floorboards. The sound seemed to cut through the noise, and a few heads turned. Strangers were not uncommon in a railroad town, but there was something about the way Cole moved, a weary, predatory grace that made men watch him. He found a space at the end of the bar and signaled the barkeep. The man behind the counter was large, with a mustache that drooped past his chin and eyes that had seen too much trouble. He poured a glass of whiskey and slid it toward Cole. Then he paused, squinting in the dim light. "You look familiar," the barkeep said, his voice a gravelly rumble. Cole picked up the glass. "I have one of those faces." "No," the barkeep insisted, leaning closer. "I know you. You're one of the Maddox boys. Ran with Silas Kane's crew up in Wyoming a few years back." The name hit the room like a dropped hammer. Nearby conversation faltered. Silas Kane was not just a cattleman. He was a baron, a man who owned half the territory and ruled it with a blend of law and brutality. To be associated with him was to be feared. or hated, or both. Cole stiffened. His hand did not move toward his gun, but the stillness that came over him was more threatening than any motion. "I don't ride for Kane, not anymore." The barkeep straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at the scar on Cole's face, then at the patrons who were now openly staring. "Kane has been buying up land south of here. Some folks say he's looking to expand his graze into this valley." Cole swallowed the whiskey in one burn. It didn't help the cold feeling in his gut. "I wouldn't know. I'm just looking for work. Quiet work." The barkeep snorted, though he refilled the glass. "A man who rode with Kane doesn't usually find quiet work. But if you're looking, the freight office is hiring guards. Though I reckon the sheriff might want a word with you first." Cole nodded once, tossing a coin onto the wood. He turned his back to the room, drinking the second glass slowly, feeling the eyes on his spine. He just wanted to be anonymous. He wanted to be a ghost, but it seemed the past had a way of arriving in town 5 minutes before he did. Across town, a knock rattled the door of Lena's shop. She jumped, the dime novel slipping from her fingers to the floor. She scrambled to hide it, her heart pounding. Who would be coming here after dark? She went to the door, peering through the glass. A young boy stood there, shivering in a thin coat. It was Timmy, the sweeper from the Drover's Rest. "Mrs. Hart?" the boy called through the wood. "Mr. O'Malley sent me." Lena cracked the door open, clutching her shawl tight. "What is it? Timmy, it's Clara," the boy said, shifting from foot to foot. She tore her dress, the red one with the beads. "She's crying something fierce because she can't go on stage. And Mr. O'Malley says if she don't sing, she don't get paid. He wants you to come fix it. He'll pay double." Lena hesitated. To go into the saloon? At night, was to invite scandal. If Reverend Clay saw her, if Mrs. Galloway heard of it, the gossip would be vicious. A widow entering a den of vice. But she looked at the empty cash box on her shelf. She had rent due on the 1st of the month, and the flour bin was nearly empty. $2 could feed her for a week. "Tell him I am coming," Lena said softly. She grabbed her sewing kit, checked that the door was locked behind her, and stepped out into the wind. She wrapped her dark woolen shawl tightly around her head and shoulders, trying to make herself small, trying to become a shadow. She walked quickly, head down, fighting the wind that tried to tear the fabric from her grip. Entering the saloon through the back delivery door, Lena felt the heavy, humid heat of the place hit her. The noise was deafening. She was ushered into a small, cluttered dressing room where Clara, a girl no older than 19 with painted cheeks and frightened eyes, was sobbing over a ripped hem. Lena worked quickly, kneeling on the dirty floorboards. She stitched the tear with efficient, practiced movements, trying not to listen to the crude laughter coming from the main room. Clara smelled of cheap lavender water and fear. Lena felt a pang of sympathy. They were not so different. Really. Both of them surviving on the whims of men, both of them judged for things beyond their control. "There you are," Lena whispered, biting the thread. "It will hold." Clara wiped her eyes, sniffing. "Thank you, Mrs. Hart. You're an angel." Lena shook her head, feeling a bitter taste in her mouth. She took the coins the girl pressed into her hand, warm from being held, and turned to leave. She wanted to be gone before anyone saw her. She slipped out the back door into the alley behind the saloon. It was a narrow, dark passage, cluttered with empty crates and broken barrels. The wind howled down the tunnel of buildings, whistling through the gaps in the wood. Lena hurried, clutching her shawl, her boots slipping on the mud. "Well now, look what we have here." The voice was slurred, wet with drink. Lena froze. Two shapes detached themselves from the shadows near the woodpile. They were cow hands, smelling of manure and rot-gut whiskey. One was tall and lanky, the other broad and squat. She recognized them vaguely. Ranch hands from the Circle T. "Please, let me pass," Lena said, her voice trembling. The broad one stepped forward, blocking her path. He grinned, his teeth yellow in the gloom. "You're the widow, ain't you? The dressmaker?" I always wondered what was under all them high collars. He reached out and grabbed the edge of her shawl. Lena jerked back, but he held fast. They say you're decent, the lanky one sneered, moving to cut off her retreat. But we know better. A woman living alone, no man to keep her in line. I bet you get lonely. Don't you, darling? They shoved her. It wasn't a hard shove, but it sent her stumbling back against the rough siding of the saloon. The wood scraped her shoulder. Lena's mind went white. Suddenly, it wasn't the alley. It was her kitchen. It wasn't the cowhand. It was Thomas, his heavy hand pinning her to the wall, his breath hot on her face. Obey. She couldn't move. Her limbs felt like lead. The old terror, the conditioned response to freeze and endure, flooded her system. She felt a rush of physical sensation, fear, yes, but also a confusing, sickening awareness of their bodies pressing close. Her skin pricked. She hated herself for it. She hated that her body knew this language of domination. No, she whispered. The word was brittle, a dry leaf crumbling. The broad man laughed, a harsh, grating sound over the wind. Come on now, don't be like that. We just want a little fun. You pretend to be decent, but we know what you are. He reached for her waist, his hand heavy and clumsy. The back door of the saloon swung open with a bang. Light spilled into the alley, cutting a sharp yellow rectangle across the mud. Cole Maddox stood in the doorway. He had stepped out to escape the smoke, to breathe air that didn't taste of other men's despair. He saw them instantly. The woman pressed against the wall, her eyes wide and black with terror. The two men crowding her, like wolves circling a fawn. Cole hesitated. A single heartbeat of indecision. He was done with violence. He was done with interfering. He was just a man looking for a quiet life. If he stepped in, the quiet was gone. Then he heard the woman's small, choked sound of distress, and the hesitation vanished. He stepped off the stoop, his boots landing softly in the mud. Leave her be. The voice was low, barely raised above the wind, but it carried a weight that made the two cowhands spin around. Who the hell are you? The lanky one demanded, squinting. It doesn't matter, Cole said, walking forward. He moved with a deceptive slowness. You boys are drunk. Go sleep it off. The broad man released Lena and turned fully toward Cole, puffing out his chest. I think you'd better get back inside. Stranger, this is none of your business. He swung. It was a wide, sloppy haymaker meant to intimidate. Cole didn't flinch. He simply wasn't there when the fist arrived. He stepped inside the man's guard, his movement a blur of efficiency. He drove his left fist into the man's solar plexus, a short, sharp blow that forced the air out of the cowboy's lungs with a wet wheeze. As the man doubled over, Cole brought his knee up, catching him under the chin. The man dropped into the mud like a sack of grain. The lanky one stared, stunned, then fumbled for the knife at his belt. Don't, Cole warned. The man pulled the knife. Something dark and cold snapped inside Cole's chest. The restraint he had been holding onto slipped. He caught the man's wrist as he lunged, twisting it with a sickening pop. The knife fell. Cole slammed the man face first into the wall of the saloon, pinning him there with a forearm against his throat. He felt the old fury rising, the red haze that belonged to the range wars. He wanted to hurt this man. He wanted to break him for the cruelty in his eyes. His free hand hovered over the butt of his pistol, his knuckles white. He could feel the ghost of the massacre, the need to punish the wicked. Stop, he told himself. Stop. He forced himself to breathe. He pulled his arm back and shoved the man away. Get out of here, Cole snarled, before I change my mind. The lanky cowboy scrambled up, grabbing his groaning friend by the collar, and they stumbled away into the darkness, cursing. Cole stood there for a moment, his chest heaving, waiting for the red haze to recede. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking slightly. He turned to Lena. She was still pressed against the wall, clutching her shawl as if it were armor. Her face was pale, luminous in the sliver of light from the door. She was trembling violently. Cole saw the fear in her eyes. But he also saw something else. A shock. A recognition of the violence he was capable of. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. Lena shook her head. She couldn't speak. She was looking at him, at the scar on his face, at the way he had dismantled 2 men in seconds. She was terrified of him. And yet, beneath the terror, she felt a pull so strong it nearly buckled her knees. It was a dangerous current, a magnetic snap between her trauma and his power. He had saved her. Cole took a step closer, careful not to crowd her. He slowly extended his hand, palm up. "I'm not going to hurt you. Let me walk you to the street." Lena looked at his hand. It was large, calloused, stained with dust. It was a hand that could kill. The memory of Thomas surged, the way kindness could be a trap. If she took his hand, she was accepting his protection. If she accepted his protection, she was admitting she was weak. And if she touched him, she was terrified of what that touch might wake up inside her. "No," she whispered. She pushed herself off the wall, stumbling sideways. "I'm fine. Thank you." The words were barely audible. She didn't look at his face again. She turned and ran, her skirts kicking up mud, fleeing toward the faint lamplight of the main street. She ran not just from the alley, but from the strange, burning warmth that was rising in her chest, a heat she had been taught to call sin. Cole watched her go. He let his hand drop to his side. He stood alone in the alley, listening to the wind rattle the crates, feeling the weight of his past settling back onto his shoulders. By the next morning, the story had already twisted, as stories in Red Hollow always did. The town buzzed with it. At the general store, women leaned over barrels of beans, whispering, "I heard she was back there with those men on purpose." One said, "Why else would a widow be at the saloon after dark?" "No," another argued, lowering her voice. "It was that new drifter, the scarred one. I heard he nearly killed 2 ranch hands. Just for looking at her. They say he's a cold-blooded killer, a gunman for hire. He's dangerous." The first woman agreed. "And so is she, in her own way, leading men on. It's unnatural." The reputation of Lena Hart, already fragile, developed a new crack, and Cole Maddox, the man who wanted to be invisible, was now the center of attention. Cole found a room above the livery stable. It was cheap, smelling of hay and horse sweat, but it had a roof. He paid for a week in advance with his dwindling coin. Mid-morning, he walked to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Vance was a thick-set man with a mustache that hid his mouth and eyes that gave away nothing. He was sitting behind his desk, cleaning a rifle. When Cole walked in, "I heard you had some trouble last night," Vance said without looking up. "I didn't start it." Cole replied, "Maybe not, but you finished it loud enough." Vance set the rifle down and looked at Cole. "I checked on the name, Maddox. You rode with Kane. That was a long time ago." Vance chewed on the inside of his cheek. In this territory, the past has a way of staying fresh. "Look, I don't want trouble in my town. The cattle drive season is starting soon, and tensions are already high. I just need work. Sheriff, I'm not looking for a fight." Vance sighed, opening a drawer and pulling out a piece of paper. "The freight office needs guards for the run to Silver Creek. It's miserable work. Dust, heat, and likely bandits. The pay is low. I'll take it." Vance nodded slowly. "All right, but listen to me. Maddox, you keep your gun in your holster unless you're protecting that freight, and stay away from the widow Hart. This town is small, and people talk. You start sniffing around her, and you'll find yourself with more enemies than just a couple of drunk cow hands. I'm not interested in her." Cole lied. Vance leaned back. "Good. Keep it that way." Cole walked out into the blinding midday sun. The wind was picking up again, swirling dust around his boots. He looked down the street and saw the sign for the dressmaker's shop. The shutters were open. He tipped his hat brim lower and turned toward the freight office, walking into the wind. The weeks that followed brought a hardening to the land that seemed to seep into the bones of the people living on it. The valley around Red Hollow, usually a patchwork of sagebrush and hardy grass, turned brittle and gray. Dust devils, Tall columns of grit and dry leaves spun violently across the cracked earth, dancing like ghosts between the buildings before dissolving into the relentless wind. The creek that fed the town had slowed to a muddy trickle, and the cattle brought in from the outlying ranges were rib-thin, staggering as they fought for space at the dwindling water troughs. To the west, the distant line of mountains remained a taunting purple jaggedness against the sky. Their peaks were dusted with white, promising snow and cold nights. But down on the valley floor, the heat lingered in the day, a dry, suffocating blanket that smelled of scorched earth and desperation. Lena Hart felt the strain of the season in the ache of her fingers and the tightness of her budget. The drought meant fewer orders for new dresses. Women were patching old wool and turning collars rather than buying new calico. She spent long hours in her shop, the silence broken only by the tick of the clock and the scratch of sand against the glass. Yet, it was not the silence that troubled her most. It was the noise her heart made whenever she saw him. She saw Cole Maddox everywhere, or so it seemed. Red Hollow was too small a place to avoid anyone completely. She saw him at the town well, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, hauling buckets of water for the livery horses. She watched, hidden behind the display of bonnets in her window. As the muscles in his forearms flexed with the weight, he moved with an economy of motion, a quiet capability that made her breath catch in her throat. She saw him at the general store, buying coffee and tinned beans, counting out his coins with a slow, deliberate hand. Once, she passed him on the boardwalk. The wind had whipped her skirts around her ankles, and she had clutched her shawl tight, keeping her head down. But she had felt his presence like a physical heat. As she passed, he had tipped his hat, a small, silent gesture of respect. She had not looked at him. She had hurried past, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, angry at herself for the flush that rose in her cheeks. Why did he have to be so steady? That was the thought that plagued her. Her husband, Thomas, had been a man of erratic moods, swinging from sloppy affection to violent rage in the span of a heartbeat. Cole Maddox was like the mountains, immovable, quiet, scarred but solid, and that terrified her more than the rage. One Tuesday afternoon, the air in the shop was stifling. Lena was hemming a heavy canvas coat for Mr. Henderson, the blacksmith. Her mind was drifting. She was thinking about the alley again. She was thinking about the way Cole's hands had felt on her shoulders when he had steadied her, firm, grounding, but without the biting pressure she had learned to associate with a man's touch. She blinked, and the needle drove deep into the pad of her thumb. Lena gasped, dropping the coat. A bright bead of blood welled up, stark red against her pale skin. She put her thumb in her mouth, tasting the copper, tears springing to her eyes. "You are a fool." Lena Hart, she thought viciously. She glared at her own reflection in the darkened window pane. She was a widow with a ruined reputation, barely scraping by. Cole was a drifter with a gunfighter's eyes and a past that made the sheriff nervous. There was no world in which the two of them made sense. And even if there were, she knew what desire led to. She had learned that lesson with every bruise Thomas had left on her skin. Desire was a trick. It was the bait in the trap. To want was to invite destruction. The bell above the shop door jingled, jarring her from her self-reproach. Lena hastily wiped her thumb on a rag and smoothed her hair. "Good afternoon," she began, forcing a smile. Her smile faltered when she saw who stood in the doorway. Reverend Amos Clay filled the frame. He was a tall man, thin as a rail, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and then left out in the rain. He wore his black coat despite the heat, and he carried a Bible in one hand like a weapon. His eyes were pale blue, sharp and unblinking, the kind of eyes that seemed to strip a person down to their sins. "Mrs. Hart," Clay said. His voice was smooth, cultured, but there was an edge to it, like a razor hidden in silk. "Reverend," Lena said, dipping her head. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I was passing by and felt moved to check on you," Clay said, stepping into the shop and closing the door. The sound of the latch clicking shut made the room feel suddenly smaller. "We have not seen you at Wednesday prayer meeting for some time. I have been working late." "Reverend, times are hard." "Indeed they are," Clay said. He walked to the counter, running a long finger over a bolt of fabric. He inspected it for dust, then looked up at her. "But spiritual nourishment is more vital than bread, is it not? Especially for a woman in your precarious position." Lena clasped her hands in front of her to hide the tremor in them. "My position?" Clay sighed, a sound of heavy, burdened patience. "I speak of the incident behind the saloon. Lena, the town talks. They say you were set upon by ruffians, a terrible thing, but one must ask why a woman of virtue would be in such a place, at such an hour, unprotected." "I was working," Lena said, her voice tight. "I was fixing a dress for one of the girls. I needed the money." Clay tutted softly. "Money is a poor excuse for compromising one's soul, my dear. When a woman places herself in the path of temptation, she cannot be surprised when the wolves appear. A woman must guard herself. She must be a fortress against the baser instincts of men by walking where you walked. You invited their attention. The injustice of it burned in Lena's throat like bile. She wanted to scream that she had been the victim, that she had been attacked, but she knew better. You did not argue with Amos Clay. To argue was to be labeled rebellious. To be rebellious was to be cast out entirely. "I understand." "Reverend," she said, lowering her eyes. "Do you?" Clay moved closer, leaning over the counter. He smelled of peppermint and old paper. "I worry for you. Lena, you are alone, and you are pleasing to the eye. That is a dangerous combination. It stirs unrest. There are rumors that you have formed an acquaintance with the drifter, the Maddox man." "He helped me," Lena whispered. "He stopped them." Clay's face hardened. "He is a man of violence, a man with blood on his hands. To associate with him is to invite darkness into your life. You must be careful. A woman's reputation is like a mirror. Once cracked, it can never be made whole." He paused, letting the threat hang in the stagnant air. "I have a suggestion," Clay continued, his tone lightening to a false cheer. "The ladies' sewing circle meets on Thursday. Mrs. Clay has mentioned that they could use a skilled hand. It would be good for you to be seen in the company of decent, God-fearing women. It would show the town that you are rehabilitating yourself, that you are obedient to the moral order of our community." He was offering her a lifeline, but it was tied into a noose. Join the circle, submit to their judgment, bow her head, and perhaps they would stop whispering. Refuse, and she confirmed every lie they told about her. "Thank you." "Reverend," Lena said, her jaw aching from the effort of holding her polite expression. "I will consider it." "Do not consider too long," Clay said. He turned to the door, his hand on the latch. "The shepherd can only protect the sheep who stay within the fold. Those who wander, well, they are left to the wilderness." He left, the bell jingle sounding like a mockery in his wake. Lena stood frozen for a long time, listening to the wind, feeling the walls of her life closing in. Cole Maddox sat on the high seat of a freight wagon, a Henry rifle resting across his knees. The sun beat down on his hat, baking the dust into his coat. He was part of a small caravan, 3 wagons carrying mining supplies and dry goods to a settlement 20 miles south. It was dull, grueling work. The mules were ornery. The trail was little more than a rutted scar through the sagebrush, and the pay was barely enough to cover his room and board. But it kept his hands busy. He scanned the horizon constantly. The land here was deceptively empty. A ridge could hide a dozen riders. A dry wash could conceal a bandit ambush. But today, the only enemy was the wind. It gusted in unpredictable bursts, throwing sand into the eyes of the drivers and spooking the teams. "Whoa there!" the driver of the lead wagon shouted, hauling on the reins as the wagon lurched violently to the left. There was a loud crack, like a gunshot, followed by the grinding of wood on stone. The lead wagon sagged, the rear left corner dropping into the dirt. Cole spurred his horse forward, riding up alongside. "What happened?" Iron rim snapped, the driver yelled. Spitting dust, the wheels shattered. We ain't moving this load without a fix. They were 5 miles from town. The driver, a weathered old man named Jed, looked at the wreckage and swore. The spokes were splintered. They could replace the wheel if they had a spare. But the spare had been used on the last run and not replaced. A cost-cutting measure by the freight company. We can't leave the load here, Cole said, looking at the crates of tools and flour. We need to bind it, Jed said, kicking the broken wheel. If we can wrap the rim with rawhide or heavy canvas and lace it tight, we might limp back to town, but I don't have anything that heavy. Cole looked back toward Red Hollow. He thought of the dressmaker's shop. He thought of the bolts of fabric he had seen in the window. I'll ride back, Cole said. I know where to get canvas, and I'll bring help. He rode hard, the bay gelding eating up the ground. When he reached town, he went straight to the livery to rent a buckboard. Then to Lena's shop. He didn't want to involve her. He had told himself a dozen times to stay away, but he needed the material. And frankly, he trusted her hands more than the drunken cobbler down the street. When he explained the situation, standing awkwardly in her doorway, Lena didn't hesitate. She grabbed a roll of heavy duck canvas, a leather punch, and spools of waxed thread. I'll come, she said. If you need it sewn tight enough to hold a wagon, you'll need me to do it. Cole wanted to argue, to tell her it was too rough out there, but he saw the set of her jaw. She looked like she needed to leave that shop as much as he needed to leave his past. They rode out in the buckboard, Cole driving, Lena clutching the supplies. The silence between them was thick, filled only by the rattle of the wheels and the wind. Lena watched his hands on the reins, competent, gentle with the horses. She thought of Clay's words, a man of violence. When they reached the stranded wagon, the wind had picked up, turning the sky a bruised copper color. Sand was flying in horizontal sheets. We have to hurry, Cole shouted over the gale. They set to work. It was brutal labor. Cole and Jed used a jack to lift the wagon axle, while Lena cut the canvas into strips. The wind tore at her hair, pulling it loose from its pins, whipping it across her face. Cole knelt in the dirt, holding the splintered spokes together. Lena knelt beside him, wrapping the heavy fabric, pulling the waxed thread through with an awl. Her hands were small next to the rough wood, but they were strong. She worked with a fierce concentration, ignoring the grit stinging her skin. Hold it there, she shouted, wrestling with a strip of wet rawhide they were using to bind the canvas. As she leaned in to tie the knot, a sudden, violent gust slammed into the wagon. The jack slipped. The heavy wagon groaned and shifted, tilting dangerously toward them. Lena, Cole didn't think. He lunged. He grabbed her by the waist and threw himself backward, pulling her with him. They hit the dirt hard, rolling away just as the wagon wheel crashed down into the sand where she had been kneeling. They came to rest in a tangle of limbs, the dust swirling around them in a choking cloud. Cole was on his back. Lena sprawled on top of him. His arms were wrapped tight around her, one hand cradling the back of her head, protecting her from the fall. For a second, the world stopped. Lena lay there, her face inches from his. She could feel the hard slab of his chest beneath her, rising and falling with his breath. She could feel the heat of his body radiating through his shirt, the strength of the arms that held her. It was an embrace, accidental and desperate, but an embrace nonetheless. She looked into his eyes. They were gray, like storm clouds, and wide with concern. There was no aggression in them, no greed, just a terrified relief that she was safe. In that heartbeat, Lena felt a treacherous, terrifying surrender. She wanted to stay there. She wanted to bury her face in his neck and let him hold her. Let him be the shield against the wind and the town and the loneliness. The desire pierced her like a knife, sharp and agonizing. Then the shame hit her. Unwholesome entanglements, the memory of Thomas, the fear of her own weakness. She scrambled backward, gasping, pushing against his chest. Let me go! Cole released her instantly. He rolled to his knees and stood up, backing away. His hands raised, palms out. I'm sorry, he said, his voice rough with dust. The jack slipped. I didn't want it to crush you. Lena stood up, brushing the dirt from her skirts with shaking hands. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Her face burned, and she knew it wasn't just from the wind. "I'm fine," she snapped, her voice high and brittle. "I'm fine. You don't need to grab me." She saw the look on his face, hurt, quickly masked by that stoic reserve. He saw the panic in her eyes, the way she flinched. He understood. He remembered the bruise on her spirit he had seen in the alley. "I won't touch you, Lena," he said quietly, lowering his voice so the other men wouldn't hear. "I promise you. I will never put a hand on you unless you ask me to. I was just trying to keep you safe." The words hung between them. "Unless you ask me to." It was the ask that undid her. Thomas had never asked. The men in the alley hadn't asked. Reverend Clay didn't ask. He commanded. Cole's restraint was a foreign language, and it confused her more than any violence could have. It gave her a choice, and she didn't know what to do with the choice. She turned away, tears stinging her eyes, mixing with the grit. "Just, let's finish the wheel," she whispered. They finished the repair in silence. The ride back to town was agonizing. They sat side by side on the buckboard seat, not touching, but the air between them crackled with the memory of their bodies pressed together in the dirt. That night, the wind howled around the eaves of Lena's shop, rattling the shutters like a thief trying to get in. Lena lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. She touched her waist where his hands had been. It wasn't a bruise this time. It was a ghost sensation of warmth. "He saved you," she told herself. Again. But the fear whispered back, "He is a man. Men take... If you give in to this, if you let yourself want him, you will lose everything you have left." But what did she have left? A business that was failing? A reputation that was in tatters? A cold bed and a colder heart? She rolled over, burying her face in the pillow to stifle a sob. She hated that she lay there imagining him in his room above the livery. She hated that she wondered if he was thinking of her. She hated the wild, confusing longing that made her body ache. A longing for something she couldn't name but knew she was starving for. The town, of course, noticed. They had seen Lena ride out on the buckboard with a stranger. They had seen them return, dusty and disheveled. The whispers grew louder. It wasn't just the women now. The men in the saloon made lewd jokes about the widow's new hand. The church elders exchanged dark looks. She can't help herself. "Mrs." Galloway whispered to the baker's wife. "It's in her blood. Her mother was wild too, you know, and now she's chasing after that hired gun. He's a killer." The baker's wife agreed, shuddering. "They say he burned a family alive up north, and she's riding in buggies with him. It's indecent." The gossip tightened around Lena like a corset, squeezing the breath out of her. When she walked to the mercantile, conversation stopped. When she entered the church on Sunday, the pew in front of her remained empty, as if her sin were contagious. Cole heard it too. He heard the comments in the livery, the snickers at the bar. His jaw would clench, and his hand would drift toward his hip, but he forced himself to walk away. He knew that fighting would only make it worse for her. Violence would only prove them right. So he tried to disappear. He took the longest freight runs. He ate his meals in his room. He crossed the street to avoid passing her window. But it was no use. The pull was gravity. It was tidal. Every time he saw her, her head bent over a dress in the window, the curve of her neck, the sadness in her posture. He felt a physical ache in his chest. He wanted to go to her. He wanted to stand between her and the town and tell them all to go to hell. But he knew that his protection was a double-edged sword. He was a tainted man. Standing next to her only stained her more. Then came the incident with Millie. Millie was 8 years old, the daughter of a poor sodbuster who lived on the edge of the valley. She didn't know about reputations or range wars. She only knew that Lena gave her candy buttons and let her play with the fabric scraps. It was a rare, calm afternoon. The wind had died down. Millie had come into the shop with her Sunday dress, torn at the pocket. I snagged it on the fence. "Miss Lena," Millie confessed, eyes wide. Mama will be so mad." Lena smiled, a genuine, soft smile that took years off her face. "We can fix that. Millie, we'll put a little embroidered flower over it. Your mama won't even know." She sat on the boardwalk outside the shop to catch the fading light, sewing the flower while Millie chattered about her kitten. Cole came walking down the street, leading his horse. He looked tired, dust coating his coat. But when he saw them, he stopped. Millie looked up and beamed. "Mr. Cole, look, Miss Lena is making a flower." Cole looked at the child, then at Lena. Lena looked up, and for a moment, she forgot to be afraid. She forgot to be ashamed. She just saw the man who had held her in the dust. "That's a mighty fine flower," Cole said, his voice gentle. Millie giggled. "You should get one on your coat, Mr. Cole." Cole smiled, and the transformation was startling. The scar on his face seemed to fade, and the hardness around his eyes melted. "I don't think I'm pretty enough for flowers." "Millie," Lena laughed. It was a small sound, rusty from disuse, but it was there. "I don't know," she said, her eyes meeting his. "A yellow daisy might bring out your eyes." It was a joke, a tiny, fragile moment of flirtation. For 3 seconds, on that boardwalk, they were just 3 people enjoying the sunset. They were a tableau of something normal, something sweet. Across the street, the curtain of the parsonage window twitched. Reverend Clay stood in the shadows, watching, his lips pressed into a thin, white line. He saw the laughter. He saw the look that passed between the widow and the gunman. He saw the defiance of joy in a woman he was trying to break. He let the curtain fall. Sunday morning broke gray and cold. The church was full. Lena sat in the back pew, as was her custom, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She felt the eyes on her neck. Reverend Clay ascended the pulpit. He did not smile. He gripped the wooden edges of the lectern until his knuckles were white. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice booming through the small timber building. "Today, we must speak of the enemy within." Lena felt a cold stone settle in her stomach. "We speak often of the dangers of the wilderness," Clay continued, "of the wolf and the storm. But the true danger, the danger that rots the soul, comes from unwholesome entanglements. It comes from those who invite darkness into our midst under the guise of friendship." He looked out over the congregation. His eyes seemed to bore straight to the back row. "Scripture tells us of the strange woman, whose lips drip honey, but whose end is bitter as wormwood. She leads the righteous astray. She opens the gate to the godless man, the man of violence, and together they weave a web of sin that ensnares the innocent." The congregation shifted. Heads turned slightly. Everyone knew who he was talking about. Lena stared at her hands, her face burning. She felt naked, flayed alive by his words. He was turning her kindness to Millie, her moment of laughter, into something distinctive and evil. "We must be vigilant," Clay thundered. "We must cut out the rot before it spreads. A woman who does not guard her virtue is a hazard to the entire town." The sermon went on for an hour, a relentless hammering of judgment. By the time the final hymn was sung, Lena felt small enough to slip through the cracks in the floor. She waited until everyone had filed out before she stood up. She walked to the door, bracing herself for the cold looks, the turned backs. She stepped out onto the church steps. The sun was setting, the sky a bruised purple. Cole was waiting at the bottom of the steps. He was leaning against the hitching rail, thumbs hooked in his belt. He was wearing his Sunday best, a clean shirt, his boots polished. He wasn't looking at the ground. He was looking straight at the crowd of churchgoers who were milling about, whispering. When Lena appeared, the whispering stopped. Cole pushed off the rail and walked up the steps. He moved with that deliberate, dangerous grace. He stopped 1 step below her, so their eyes were level. He didn't say a word to the crowd. He didn't look at Reverend Clay, who was standing by the door, his face purple with indignation. Cole took off his hat. "Evening, Mrs. Hart," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the silence. Lena stared at him. Her heart was in her throat. He was crazy. This was suicide. He was practically confirming everything Clay had just said. But then she saw his eyes. They were defiant. They were angry, but mostly, they were offering her something she hadn't had in years, an ally. He offered her his arm. "May I walk you home?" The town held its breath. This was a challenge. This was a line drawn in the dirt. Lena looked at Reverend Clay. The preacher's eyes were slits of fury. "Obey. They said, submit." Lena looked at Cole. His arm was steady. He wasn't asking her to submit. He was asking her to stand. She took a breath that shook in her lungs. She reached out and placed her hand on his forearm. "Thank you, Mr. Maddox," she said clearly. "I would like that." She felt the shock wave ripple through the crowd as they walked down the steps together. They walked down the center of the street, heads high, while the town watched in stunned silence. They didn't speak until they were away from the main street, walking down the quiet, dusty road toward her shop. The twilight was deepening, the first stars appearing over the buttes. "You shouldn't have done that," Lena said, her voice trembling. "They'll tear you apart." "Let them try," Cole said. His muscles were tight under her hand. "I couldn't let you walk out of there alone. Not after what he said. I heard it through the open door." "He's right, you know," Lena said, pulling her hand away and wrapping her arms around herself. "I am poison. Everyone who gets close to me gets hurt. Maybe I am what he says. Maybe I want things I shouldn't." She stopped walking and turned to him. The tears she had held back all day finally spilled over. "I don't trust myself. Cole," she whispered. "My husband. He taught me that my body was wrong, that wanting anything was a sin. And when I'm near you, I feel things, and it scares me. It makes me feel like I'm sliding back into a trap." Cole stepped closer. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a shelter. "Lena, look at me." She looked up, her vision blurred. "Desire isn't the sin," Cole said, his voice low and fierce. "It's just a feeling. It's just blood and breath. What matters is what you do with it. Your husband, he used it to hurt, to control. That was his sin, not yours." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, then dropping back to his side. He stuck to his promise. "You aren't poison," he said. "You're just lonely. And you're alive. There's no shame in that." Lena looked at him, her chest heaving. The honesty of his words cut through the years of conditioning. He wasn't telling her to obey. He was telling her she was human. The intensity of it, the shared vulnerability, the fact that he understood the darkness in her head, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. It was a terrifying intimacy. She couldn't handle it. Not yet. It was too much light after too many years in the dark. She turned and practically ran the last few yards to her door. She fumbled with the key, got the door open, and slipped inside. She leaned back against the wood, breathing hard, listening to his footsteps pause outside. She waited, heart pounding, until she heard him walk away into the night. Only then did she slide down the door to the floor, burying her face in her knees, trying to hold back the flood of hope that threatened to drown her. Winter arrived in Red Hollow not with a blanket of soft white, but with a clenched fist. The temperature plummeted overnight, freezing the mud of the main street into jagged ruts that twisted ankles and broke wagon wheels. The sky turned a flat, unrelenting gray, pressing down on the valley like a heavy iron lid. What snow did fall was thin and dry, scouring the earth like sand rather than covering it. It collected in the lee of the buildings and in the hollows of the frozen creek bed, offering no moisture to the parched land. The cattle, already weakened by the long drought of autumn, began to die. They huddled together in the draws, their coats matted with frost, their ribs showing starkly against their hides. Ranchers rode out in the biting dawn to chop ice from the water troughs, their breath pluming in the air, only to find stiff carcasses waiting for them. The sound of wind whistling through the gaps in the timber walls became the town's constant soundtrack, a low, mournful note that grated on the nerves. Tempers in town frayed like old rope. In the saloon, arguments over card games turned violent with little provocation. At the general store, Women squabbled over the last sack of flour or the price of dried beans. Fear was a contagion, spreading from house to house. People looked at the barren fields and the empty sky, and then they looked for someone to blame. It was into this atmosphere of scarcity and suspicion that Silas Kane rode. He arrived mid-morning on a Tuesday, leading a procession that looked like a king's retinue crossing a wasteland. Kane rode a massive black stallion. An animal fed on grain while the local horses gnawed on sagebrush. He wore a coat of heavy buffalo hide with a collar of fur, and his boots were polished to a shine that seemed obscene against the dusty backdrop of Red Hollow. Behind him rode 6 men, well-armed and well-fed, their eyes scanning the street with professional indifference. The townspeople stopped their work to watch. Some took off their hats, eyes wide with the instinctive deference of the poor toward the rich. They saw the money Kane represented, the cattle contracts, the land purchases, the flow of silver dollars that could save a dying town. Others, the smaller ranchers who held their few acres by the skin of their teeth, watched with a cold knot of dread in their stomachs. They knew what men like Silas Kane meant. They meant fences. They meant water rights disappearing. They meant the end of the open range. Cole Maddox was repairing a cinch strap outside the livery stable when the cavalcade rode past. The sound of the hooves on the frozen ground made him look up. He froze. The leather strap slipped from his fingers. For a moment, the gray street of Red Hollow vanished. In its place, Cole saw a homestead in Wyoming. 3 years ago, he smelled the acrid stench of kerosene and the sickening sweetness of burning pine. He heard the roar of flames eating a sod roof. He saw a woman standing in the yard, clutching a baby to her chest, her eyes wide and screaming a silent plea as the men around him laughed. He saw himself, sitting on his horse, doing nothing, just watching, paralyzed by a misplaced loyalty that had turned his soul into ash. The man at the front of that memory was the same man riding past him now. Silas Kane looked older, perhaps a little heavier, but the set of his jaw and the arrogant tilt of his head were unchanged. He looked like a man who believed the world existed solely to be carved up and put in his pocket. Cole stepped back into the shadows of the livery doorway, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt the phantom weight of his old gun belt, the one he had traded for a quiet life. He wanted to turn and walk away, to disappear into the hills until this storm passed, but his feet wouldn't move. Kane pulled his stallion up in front of the hotel. He swung down from the saddle with a grunt, handing the reins to one of his men. As he turned to survey the town, his gaze swept across the street and locked onto the livery stable. The recognition was instant. Kane's eyes narrowed, then widened. A slow, shark-like grin spread across his face. "Well, I will be damned," Kane bellowed, his voice booming in the thin, cold air. He strode across the street, ignoring the frozen mud. Cole stiffened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Cole Maddox!" Kane shouted, clapping a heavy hand on Cole's shoulder. "I thought you had died in a ditch somewhere south of the border." Cole flinched at the touch. He stepped back, shrugging the hand off with a sharp, deliberate movement. The air between them crackled. Kane's men, still mounted, shifted their hands toward their weapons. "I am still breathing." "Silas," Cole said, his voice low and rough like gravel. Kane laughed, a loud, expansive sound that held no warmth. "Breathing and hiding. It looks like, look at you, working as a stable boy, a man of your talents. Those talents are retired." Cole said, "Retired." Kane scoffed. "You don't retire from what you are. Cole, you just take a break." He looked Cole up and down, taking in the worn coat and the exhaustion etched around his eyes. "I am expanding my operations here. Cole, buying up the valley. I could use a man who knows how to handle difficult situations. The pay is better than whatever you are making mucking out stalls." "I am not interested," Cole said. "I am done with your kind of work." Kane's smile didn't falter, but his eyes went cold and hard, like flint. "Everyone has a price. Cole, you just haven't gotten desperate enough yet, but looking at this town, looking at you, I reckon it won't be long. He turned his back on Cole, dismissing him as easily as he would a fly, and walked toward the hotel, his coat billowing behind him. Cole stood in the cold, shaking. He wasn't shaking from fear, but from a rage so old and deep it felt like it was burning a hole in his stomach. He had run 1,000 miles to get away from Silas Kane, and the devil had found him anyway. That evening, the lamps in the parsonage were burning late. Reverend Amos Clay sat in his high-backed chair, a cup of tea growing cold on the table beside him. Opposite him sat Silas Kane, swirling a glass of brandy that he had brought with him, much to the Reverend's silent disapproval. They were an odd pair, the ascetic preacher who preached fire and brimstone, and the cattle baron who lived by the law of the gun, but they shared a language, the language of control. "This town is a mess, Reverend," Kane said, taking a sip of the brandy. "Disorderly, weak. You have got small-time ranchers squatting on prime grazing land, starving their herds because they are too stubborn to sell. It is bad for business, and bad business breeds chaos." Clay nodded slowly, his fingers steepled under his chin. "It breeds more than chaos. Mr. Kane, poverty breeds immorality. When men are desperate, they turn to drink. When women are desperate, they turn to other means." "Exactly," Kane said, leaning forward. "I can bring order here. I can bring money. I can buy out the smallholds, consolidate the land, and put this town on the map. But I need the community to be cooperative. I need them to understand that holding on to the past is only hurting them." Clay looked into the fire. "Resistance is a sin when it opposes the natural order. Some in this town are stiff-necked. They cling to their pride, and they cling to their troublemakers." Kane added softly, "I have heard talk. There are elements here that stir up defiance. That woman, the dressmaker. Hart, is it?" Clay's expression tightened. "Mrs. Hart is a troubled soul, a vessel of temptation." "She is a symbol," Kane corrected. "My men tell me she is practically running a charity ward out of her shop, patching clothes for the holdouts, keeping them warm so they can keep refusing my offers. And she is friendly with my old friend Maddox. That is a dangerous combination. Reverend, a loose woman and a retired killer, giving hope to people who should be moving on." Clay looked up, his pale eyes catching the firelight. "What are you suggesting?" "Mr. Kane, I am suggesting that for the good of the town, for the moral and economic health of Red Hollow, certain weeds need to be pulled." Kane said, "If the town were to turn against them, if the town were to see them for the danger they are, well, the small ranchers would lose their heart. They would sell. Order would be restored. And you, Reverend, would have a flock that is purified." Clay was silent for a long moment. He did not like Kane. He found the man's greed distasteful, but he hated Lena Hart's defiance more. He hated the way she walked with her head up, the way she had looked at him on the church steps. She was a stain on his authority. "God often uses harsh instruments to prune his garden," Clay said quietly. "If their removal brings the flock back to the path of righteousness, then it is a necessary burden." Kane smiled, raising his glass. "To order, Reverend, to morality." Clay replied. The winter deepened, and Lena's world shrank. After the sermon and the incident on the church steps, the respectable women of Red Hollow stopped coming to her shop. Mrs. Galloway sent a note canceling her order for a spring coat. The banker's wife crossed the street to avoid walking past Lena's window. The silence in the shop was heavy and suffocating. But Lena did not starve. As the wealthy customers vanished, the poor appeared. They came to the back door after dark, clutching threadbare trousers and torn blankets. The wives of the small ranchers, the laborers from the rail yard, the families living in sod houses on the flats. They had no money, but they had gratitude. Mrs. Gable brought a basket of eggs in exchange for patching her husband's heavy coat. Mr. O'Connor, a rancher who was holding out against Kane, brought a sack of potatoes in exchange for sewing canvas covers for his feed stores. Lena worked harder than she ever had. Her fingers were pricked and calloused, her eyes strained from sewing by candlelight to save oil. But there was a new feeling in the work. She wasn't sewing vanity anymore. She was sewing survival. She was keeping children warm. She was helping men work. And she was not entirely alone. Cole came almost every evening. He told himself it was practical. He brought work from the freight office, harnesses that needed restitching, heavy wagon covers that had ripped in the wind. He insisted on paying her, counting out his coins on the counter with a stubborn grimace when she tried to refuse. "You are doing me a favor. Lena," he would say. "The company would charge me for the replacement if I didn't get it fixed." He stayed while she worked. Outside, the wind would batter the walls, whistling through the cracks. But inside, the stove cast a warm, red glow. Cole would sit on a crate near the heat, mending a bridle or oiling his holster, while Lena sat in a rocking chair, the needle flashing in the dim light. They talked. At first, it was halting, comments about the weather, the freight runs, the price of grain. But slowly, the spaces between the words filled with something softer. Cole spoke of the land he had seen before the wars, high mountain valleys where the grass grew to a horse's belly, places where the water was sweet and cold. He spoke of his desire to build something, a cabin with a porch facing east, away from the blood and the dust. Lena spoke of books. She told him the stories from her dime novels, laughing at the absurdity of them. But then her voice would drop, and she would talk about the loneliness of the heroine, the feeling of being trapped in a tower of someone else's making. They never spoke of the future. The future was a terrifying thing, looming like the mountains in the dark. They lived in the hour between supper and sleep, a fragile pocket of time that belonged only to them. One night, the wind was worse than usual. It hammered against the shop like a physical blow, shaking the timber frame. A draft caught the flame of Lena's single candle, and it guttered and died, plunging the room into darkness save for the orange light bleeding through the grate of the iron stove. "Oh," Lena sighed, lowering her hands. "Don't move," Cole said. His voice was close. "I will light it." He stood up, the leather of his chaps creaking. He moved to the stove to grab a spill of wood. Lena stood up too, intending to find the matches on the shelf. In the dark, they moved toward each other. They collided gently. Lena gasped as her shoulder bumped against his chest. She put a hand out to steady herself and found his arm. It was hard as iron under the flannel shirt. Cole froze. He didn't step back. The air in the room seemed to vanish. The wind outside roared, a chaotic violence that made the stillness inside feel profound and heavy. The red light from the stove grate painted the side of Cole's face, illuminating the scar, the sharp line of his jaw, the dark intensity of his eyes looking down at her. Lena could smell him, leather, wood smoke, and the scent of the cold wind clinging to his clothes. Her hand was still on his arm. She could feel the heat of him seeping into her palm. Her heart began to race, a frantic bird in her chest. All her life, touch had been a transaction or a violation. It had been something taken. But this, standing in the dark, the warmth of him radiating toward her, this was a hunger. The old patterns rose up in her mind like a tide. She was tired. God, she was so tired of fighting the town, fighting the cold, fighting her own memories. She wanted to surrender. She wanted to lean into him, to let his strength swallow her up so she didn't have to be strong anymore. She wanted him to take the decision away from her. She took a half-step closer, her face tilted up toward his. "I don't want to be alone tonight," she whispered. The words hung in the air, raw and desperate. Cole's hand came up. For a second, Lena thought he would pull her in. She thought he would kiss her, and she would let him, and the world would disappear. But his hand didn't grab her. It cupped her cheek. His thumb brushed over her skin, rough but impossibly gentle. It was a touch of reverence, not possession. He looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was vivid in the firelight. "Lena," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you are scared, and you are tired." "I know," she breathed, leaning into his hand. "If I stay," Cole said, his voice thickening, "if I touch you the way I want to touch you, It has to be because you want me, not because you are afraid of the dark, not because you want to disappear." He stepped back. The loss of his warmth was a physical blow. "I want you to choose me. Lena, when you aren't running from something." He was trying to save her. He was trying to give her the one thing she had never had, agency. He was refusing to be another man who used her vulnerability for his own comfort. But Lena couldn't see that. All she felt was the rejection. She felt the shame of having offered herself and being turned away. She felt the humiliation of her own need, naked and exposed. The old voice in her head, Reverend Clay's voice, Thomas's voice, screamed that she was unwanted, that her desire was dirty, that she had thrown herself at a man who saw her brokenness and was disgusted by it. She pulled back as if burned. Tears, hot and fast, sprang to her eyes. "You think you are better than me?" she lashed out, her voice cracking. "You think you can stand there and judge me, just like them, just like the preacher?" Cole flinched. "No, Lena, no, I'm trying to protect you." "Protect me?" Lena laughed, a sharp, hysterical sound. "From what? From feeling something? You look at me like I am glass that's going to break. I am not glass. Cole, I am a woman, and I am standing right here." "I know you are," Cole said, struggling to keep his voice even. "God help me, I know. That is why I am stopping. Because if I start, I won't be able to stop. And I won't have you hating yourself in the morning because you used me to forget him." "Don't you talk about him," Lena shouted. "You don't know anything about it." The storm rattled the door in its frame, matching the fury in the room. "I am leaving," Cole said, grabbing his hat. "Before I say something I regret, or do something that hurts you." He turned and walked out. The door slammed behind him, letting in a swirl of snow and freezing air that instantly killed the warmth of the room. Lena stood in the dark, shaking. She wrapped her arms around herself, digging her fingers into her ribs. "Come back," she whispered to the empty room. But he didn't. She collapsed into her rocking chair, sobbing into her hands. She hated him for leaving. She hated him for being noble, but mostly, she hated herself for the desperate, clawing need that lived inside her, the need that made her beg a man to stay. The morning brought no relief. The wind had died down, but the cold remained, sharp and crystalline. Cole did not come to the shop that day. Lena sat by the window, her eyes swollen, stitching a pair of trousers for Mr. O'Connor's youngest son. Every time a horse passed, she looked up, hope and dread warring in her chest. But it wasn't Cole who rode through town. It was Cain's men. They rode in a pack, bold and loud. They stopped at the small ranches on the outskirts, leaning over their saddle horns to have friendly conversations about land prices. The implication was clear. Sell now, while the offer stands. That afternoon, Mr. O'Connor came into Lena's shop. He was a sturdy man, but he looked shaken. He held his hat in his hands, twisting the brim. "They came to my place. Lena," he said quietly, "Cain's foreman, offered me half what the land is worth. Said the drought is only going to get worse. Said accidents happen to folks who don't know when to quit." "What did you say?" Lena asked. "I told them to get off my land. My father is buried on that hill. I am not selling to a vulture like Silas Cain." Lena squeezed his hand. "You are a brave man, Daniel, or a foolish one," O'Connor muttered. The sun went down, bleeding red across the snow. The town grew quiet. Lena went to bed early, exhausted by her grief and the tension in the air. She fell into a restless sleep, dreaming of fire and ice. She woke to the sound of shouting. Lena sat up, heart pounding. The room was flickering with a strange, dancing light that came through the cracks in the shutters. It wasn't dawn. The light was too orange, too erratic. She scrambled out of bed, pulling on her wrapper, and ran to the window, to the south, on the edge of town. A column of fire was twisting into the night sky. Sparks drifted up like angry fireflies, carried by the returning wind. It was the O'Connor barn. Lena watched in horror as the flames consumed the structure. She could hear the distant screams of horses trapped inside, a sound that made her blood run cold. She saw tiny figures running with buckets, useless against the inferno. By the time the sun rose, the barn was a heap of smoldering ash. The O'Connors had lost their winter feed, their plow horses, and their milk cow. They were ruined. The town gathered at the general store, their faces gray with lack of sleep and fear. The air smelled of wet ash. "It's a curse," someone whispered. "It's God's judgment," another voice answered. Reverend Clay stood on the boardwalk, looking out over the frightened crowd. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He just spoke with a heavy, sorrowful certainty. "We have harbored sin in our midst," he said. "We have allowed unrighteousness to take root. We have turned a blind eye to the wicked. And now the innocent suffer." He didn't say Lena's name. He didn't have to. The eyes of the town turned toward her shop. They looked at the dark windows. They remembered the rumors. They remembered the cowboy she walked with. They remembered the unwholesome entanglements. Cole stood on the edge of the crowd, his face like stone. He had been up all night, helping to beat back the flames at the O'Connor place. His hands were blistered, his coat singed. He heard the whispers. "She brings bad luck. She's keeping company with that killer. The devil is in this town because of her." He looked at the smoldering ruins of the barn. He knew this wasn't God. This was kerosene and a match. This was Silas Kane sending a message. Cole scanned the crowd and saw Judd Mercer, Kane's foreman, leaning against a post, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. Mercer met Cole's gaze and winked. A cold clarity settled over Cole. They weren't just burning barns to scare ranchers. They were burning them to turn the town against the only people resisting. They were using the town's prejudice as a weapon, and Lena was the target. Cole turned and walked away from the crowd, heading toward the livery. He needed to clean his gun. The quiet days were over. The fire had started, and he knew, with a sickening certainty, that it was going to spread until it consumed them all. The winter that followed the burning of the O'Connor barn was a beast with teeth. It did not simply settle over the valley. It attacked, late in the season, when the calendar promised the softening of spring. The sky instead turned the color of a bruised plum and unleashed a fury of snow that buried the sagebrush and drifted high against the north walls of the buildings. Then, just as quickly, the temperature spiked, turning the frozen world into a morass of sucking mud and gray slush. The road into Red Hollow became impassable. Wagons sank to their axles in the mire, the mules thrashing and braying in exhaustion. Supplies in the general store dwindled to dust and weevils. The coffee jar was empty, the sugar barrel scraped clean. Desperation was a tangible thing, a sharp scent that hung in the air alongside the smell of wet wool and wood smoke. Lena Hart felt the season in the hollow of her ribs. She had grown thin, the bones of her wrists prominent as she worked the needle. She skipped the midday meal, and often the evening one, telling herself she was not hungry, though her stomach cramped with a hollow ache. She saved what little food she had for the days when the work was hardest. Yet, she kept sewing. The wealthy women had abandoned her, but the town's invisible population had not. They came to her back door in the twilight, the washerwomen, the wives of the section hands, the girls who worked in the saloon. They brought clothes that were falling apart, fabric worn so thin it was like gauze. Lena patched them. She turned collars. She reinforced seams with heavy thread she had bought with her last few coins. She did not ask for money, for she knew they had none. But payment came in other forms. One afternoon, the bell above the door chimed softly. It was Millie, the little girl whose dress Lena had fixed with the embroidered flower. She was bundled in a coat 3 sizes too big, her nose red from the damp cold. "Miss Lena?" she whispered, clutching a small bundle wrapped in a checkered napkin. "Come in. Millie, close the door. Quickly," Lena said, setting down her shears. Millie hurried to the counter and placed the bundle down with solemn importance. "Mama made bread today. It is yeast bread, not biscuit. She said you should have the end piece because it has the most crust." Lena unwrapped the cloth. The bread was still warm, smelling of yeast and life. Beside it lay a handful of dried juniper berries, dark and wrinkled. "And Papa found these," Millie added. "He said they are good for tea." Tears pricked Lena's eyes. Hot and sudden, This loaf likely represented half of what the family had for the day. "Thank you, Millie. You tell your mama and papa that I am very grateful." Millie beamed, revealing a missing front tooth. "Mama says you are the only one who keeps us warm. Miss Lena." When the girl left, Lena broke off a piece of the crust and ate it slowly, closing her eyes. It tasted like salvation. It tasted like she was not entirely forgotten. But not everyone had forgotten her for the right reasons. 2 days later, Reverend Amos Clay came to the shop. The mud on the street was ankle deep, but the Reverend's boots were scraped clean, as if the filth of the world dared not cling to him. He did not browse the fabric this time. He stood in the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, looking at Lena with a mixture of pity and distaste. "I see you are still struggling, Mrs. Hart," Clay said, his voice dropping into the lower register he used for funerals. "I am managing—" "Reverend," Lena said, not looking up from the shirt she was mending. "Managing?" Clay made a sound that was half sigh, half scoff. "You are wasting away." "And for what? Pride? Stubbornness?" "I am working," Lena said. "You are defying the natural order," Clay corrected. "This town is suffering. Lena, we are all suffering, but you seem determined to bring more misfortune upon yourself." He took a step closer. The air in the shop felt suddenly thin. "I have come to offer you a way out," he said. Lena's needle paused. She looked up, wary. "A way out?" "Repentance," Clay said. "Public repentance. If you were to stand before the congregation this Sunday and confess your indiscretions, if you were to renounce the company of that gunman and promise to leave Red Hollow, I could arrange for the church to provide you with funds for travel, enough to start over somewhere else, somewhere where your history is not known." "And if I do not want to leave?" Lena asked, her voice quiet. Clay's eyes narrowed. "Then there is another path. I have spoken with Mr. Abernathy. He is a widower, a God-fearing man who owns a farm in the next valley. He is in need of a wife to raise his children and keep his house. He is willing to overlook your damaged reputation, provided you submit to his guidance and the guidance of the church." Lena felt a wave of nausea roll through her stomach. Mr. Abernathy was a man of 50 with eyes like wet stones and a reputation for beating his horses. "You want me to marry him?" Lena whispered. "I want you to be safe," Clay said smoothly. "I want you to be under the protection of a man who can curb your willful nature. It is a generous offer. Lena, most men would not take a woman who has been the subject of such scandal. You should be grateful. Grateful." The word echoed in her mind. It was the same word Thomas had used. "You should be grateful I put a roof over your head," he would say, right before he raised his hand. "You should be grateful I keep you in line." Clay was not offering her salvation. He was offering her a cage. He saw her not as a person, but as a problem to be solved, a loose thread to be snipped or tied down. "I cannot do that, Reverend," Lena said. Her voice shook, but her chin came up. Clay stared at her for a long moment. The pity vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, hard judgment. "Then you choose your own destruction," he said. "Do not say I did not try to save you." He turned and walked out, leaving the door unlatched so the damp wind blew in, chilling Lena to the bone. That evening, the temperature dropped again. The slush in the street began to freeze into treacherous ridges of ice. Lena was outside behind the shop, struggling with the woodpile. Her supply was low, the logs heavy and wet. She was shivering in her thin shawl, her fingers numb as she tried to dislodge a piece of oak from the frozen stack. "Let me get that." She jumped, dropping the log. Cole stood at the corner of the alley. He looked tired, his duster stained with mud, his hat pulled low, but his eyes were clear. He didn't wait for her permission. He stepped forward and began gathering the wood, stacking it easily in the crook of his arm. He took the heavy oak log she had been fighting and added it to the pile. "Open the door," he said gently. Lena hurried to open the back door, and he carried the wood inside, dumping it into the box by the stove. He knelt and began to build up the fire, his movements efficient and practiced. Lena stood by the table, watching him. She hadn't spoken to him since the night of the storm, the night she had begged him to stay and he had left. The shame of that memory still burned in her cheeks. Cole got the fire roaring, then stood up and dusted off his hands. He didn't look at her immediately. He looked at the floor, then at the window, then finally, bravely, at her face. "I wanted to say I am sorry," he said, "for leaving the way I did, for the things I said." "You were right," Lena said, her voice tight. I was not myself." "No," Cole said, taking a step toward her. "You were honest. And I was scared." "Scared?" Lena looked at him, surprised. The idea of Cole Maddox, the man who had faced down 2 drunks without blinking, being scared seemed impossible. "I look at you, Lena, and I see something good," Cole said, his voice rough. "Something clean, and I look at myself, and I see blood. I see mistakes I can't fix. Being near you, it makes me want things I have no right to want. I was afraid if I stayed, I would stain you with my own dirt." Lena felt a crack in the wall she had built around her heart. She looked at his hands, large, scarred, capable of violence, but currently hanging open and empty at his sides. She took a step closer. The heat from the stove was beginning to fill the room, but the real warmth was coming from the look in his eyes. "I don't know how to do this, Cole," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to want someone without losing myself. Thomas, he took everything. He made me small. He made me think that my own body was a traitor. When I feel things for you, I feel like I'm doing something wrong. I feel dirty." Cole's face twisted with pain. He closed the distance between them, stopping just inches away. "You are not dirty," he said fiercely. "You are the bravest thing I have ever seen." They stood there in the quiet shop, the fire popping in the grate. They were close enough to share the same air. Lena could see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes. She could see the pulse beating in his throat. She was tired of fighting. She was tired of the Reverend, tired of the town, tired of her own fear. "I'm so tired." "Cole," she whispered. "I know," he answered. He reached out. His hand trembled slightly, a tremor of restraint, of powerful emotion held in check. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek, his knuckles grazing her skin. The touch was electric. It was a promise. Lena closed her eyes, leaning into his hand. For the first time in her life, a man's touch felt like a gift, not a demand. Crash! The sound was explosive. The front window of the shop shattered inward, spraying shards of glass across the floor. A heavy stone skidded across the wooden planks and slammed into the counter. Lena screamed, flinching back. Cole moved instantly. The tenderness vanished, replaced by a terrifying speed. His hand went to his hip, drawing the heavy Colt revolver before the glass had even stopped falling. He spun toward the broken window, his body a coiled spring of lethal intent. "Stay down," he barked. He strode toward the door, his boots crunching on the glass. "Cole, no!" Lena cried, grabbing his arm. He looked back at her, his eyes wild with fury. "Someone just threw a rock at you. Lena, please!" Lena begged, her grip tightening. "If you go out there with a gun, if you hurt someone, they will hang you. They are waiting for you to make a mistake. Please, Cole, don't give them what they want." Cole hesitated. He looked at the dark street through the jagged hole in the window. He could hear running footsteps fading into the night, cowardly and fast. His jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. He wanted to hunt them down. He wanted to make them pay. But he looked at Lena. She was shaking, her eyes wide with terror. She wasn't scared of the rock. She was scared for him. He slowly lowered the hammer of the gun and holstered it. He walked to the stone lying on the floor. It was a jagged river rock, wrapped in twine. A piece of paper was tied to it. Cole picked it up, untying the string. He unfolded the paper. The handwriting was crude, block letters scrawled in charcoal. "Whore, leave or burn." Cole crumpled the paper in his fist. He looked at the shattered window, then at Lena, who was hugging herself in the middle of the room. "I will fix the window," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "And I am not going far. I will sleep in the alley if I have to. No one touches this place again while I am breathing." The next morning, the atmosphere in Red Hollow had shifted from tension to open hostility. Silas Kane sat in the sheriff's office, his polished boots resting on the sheriff's desk. Sheriff Vance looked uncomfortable, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the chill in the room. "We have investors coming from Chicago next month." "Vance," Kane said, examining his fingernails, "men with deep pockets. They want to see a town that is open for business, not a town plagued by fires and loose women and washed-up gunfighters. I can't just arrest people for nothing." "Mr. Kane," Vance muttered. "Nothing?" Kane raised an eyebrow. "You have a woman running a house of ill repute, or close enough to it. You have a man who is known to be unstable carrying a weapon in your streets. You have squatters on land that should be productive." He dropped a piece of paper on the desk. "Here is a list," Kane said. "Troublesome elements. If you can't find a reason to lock them up, find a reason to move them on, or I will bring in men who can—" Vance looked at the list. Lena Hart's name was at the top, followed by Cole Maddox and 3 small ranchers, including O'Connor. This isn't right." "Silas, make it right," Kane said, standing up, "or I will find a sheriff who will—" The fire did not start with a roar. It started with a whisper. It was 3 nights after the rock incident. The wind was blowing hard from the north, drying out the timber of the buildings. Lena was asleep in the back room, exhausted after spending 2 days boarding up her window and sweeping glass. Someone poured kerosene along the base of the back wall. A match was struck. The flame caught the dry wood like a lover, curling up the siding, finding the gaps, eating into the insulation of old newspapers and sawdust. Lena was dreaming of suffocation. In her dream, Thomas was holding a pillow over her face. She couldn't breathe. She thrashed, gasping for air. She woke up coughing. The room was not dark. It was filled with a thick, acrid gray fog. The air was hot, unbearably hot. A roaring sound, like a freight train, was coming from the other side of the wall. Fire! The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She scrambled out of bed, her eyes stinging and watering. She reached for the door to the shop, but the handle was searing hot. She pulled her hand back with a cry. She was trapped. The back door was blocked by the heaviest flames. She could see the orange glow outlining the frame. The door to the shop was impassable. She dropped to the floor, where the air was slightly clearer, crawling toward the window. But she had boarded it up. She had nailed heavy planks across it to keep out the stones. "Help!" she screamed, but the smoke swallowed her voice. "Help me!" The heat was intensifying. The ceiling boards above her began to groan. Cole was riding back from a late freight run. He was a mile out of town when he saw it, a glow against the night sky. Not a lantern, too big, too red. He spurred his horse, the bay gelding, sensing his urgency, stretched out into a gallop. As they crested the rise, Cole saw the location. It was the dressmaker's shop. No, he breathed. He rode into town like a demon, not slowing down as he hit the main street. He pulled the horse up in a spray of mud right in front of the shop. The building was a torch. Flames were licking up the front, fueled by the fabrics inside. The glass of the display window had blown out from the heat. Cole! He didn't know who shouted his name. He didn't care. He jumped from the horse, pulling his bandana up over his nose and mouth. "Lena!" he roared. He didn't wait for water. He didn't wait for help. He lowered his shoulder and slammed into the front door. It was locked, swollen from the heat. He backed up and kicked it, putting every ounce of his strength into the blow. The wood splintered. He kicked again, and the door gave way. He was hit by a wall of heat that singed his eyebrows. The smoke was a solid black curtain. "Lena!" He pushed inside. The shop was an inferno. Bolts of calico were burning like torches. The counter was ablaze. He squinted, eyes streaming, trying to see through the gloom. Cole! It was a faint, choked sound from the back. He moved low, crouching under the smoke. He fought his way past the burning shelves, dodging a falling beam that showered sparks over his coat. He reached the curtain that separated the shop from the living quarters. The curtain disintegrated into ash as he touched it. He found her on the floor near the bed. She was curled in a ball, coughing weakly, her wrapper scorched. He scooped her up. She felt terrifyingly light. She clung to him, burying her face in his coat. "Hold on," he gritted out. The ceiling groaned. Cole looked up and saw the main beam sagging. "Move." He turned and ran, carrying her through the gauntlet of fire. The heat blistered the skin on his neck. He shielded her head with his arm, barreling through the smoke, guided only by the rectangle of slightly less black air that was the door. They burst out into the street just as the roof of the shop collapsed inward with a thunderous crash, sending a geyser of sparks into the sky. Cole stumbled, his knees hitting the mud. He didn't let go of Lena. He crawled a few feet further, away from the radiant heat, and then collapsed back against a water trough, pulling her into his lap. "Lena." She was coughing, her body racking with spasms. Her face was black with soot, streaked with tears. Her hair was singed on one side, but she opened her eyes. They were red-rimmed and terrified, but alive. I couldn't get out." She wheezed. "I know," Cole rasped, smoothing her hair with a shaking hand. "I know. I have got you." He looked up. A crowd had gathered. They stood in a semicircle, illuminated by the flames of Lena's home. Some held buckets, but they weren't using them. Most just watched. Cole saw the sheriff. He saw the baker. He saw Mrs. Galloway. And standing at the back, his face unreadable in the firelight, was Reverend Clay. A fury unlike anything Cole had ever felt rose up in him. It wasn't the cold rage of the gunfighter. It was the hot, screaming rage of a man protecting what he loved. He struggled to his feet, lifting Lena with him. She clung to his neck, burying her face against his chest to hide from the crowd. "You watched," Cole screamed at them. His voice cracked, raw from the smoke. "You stood there and watched it burn." No one answered. The sheriff looked at his boots. "She was in there!" Cole yelled, pointing a trembling finger at the crowd. "Someone barred the door. Someone set this fire. This wasn't an accident. This was murder. It is God's will." A woman's voice drifted from the back. Cole took a step forward, his eyes blazing. "God's will? You call this God? You people are sick. You talk about morality, and you let a woman burn because you don't like who she talks to." He looked at the sheriff. "Vance, do your job. Find who did this." Vance looked at the fire, then at the shadowy figure of one of Kane's men standing on the boardwalk. He shook his head slightly. "Fire happens. Maddox," Vance said weakly. "Old wood. Dry winter." Cole looked at him with pure disgust. "You coward." He looked at Reverend Clay. The preacher met his gaze. There was no remorse in Clay's eyes, only a cold satisfaction. The weed had been pulled. Cole tightened his grip on Lena. "Come on," he whispered to her. "Where?" Lena sobbed into his coat. "I have nowhere. We will find a place." He walked to the inn. The owner stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "We are full," he said shortly. Cole walked to the boarding house. The landlady took one look at Lena's soot-stained wrapper and shook her head. "No trouble here. I run a respectable house." Finally. Cole walked to the livery stable. The owner, a man named Jess, who had once borrowed tobacco from Cole, looked at them. He looked at Lena shivering in the cold night air. "The loft," Jess grunted, jerking his chin toward the ladder. "It is warm enough. Just don't let anyone see you. And no fires." "Thank you," Cole said. He carried Lena up the ladder into the hayloft. It was dark, smelling of sweet dry grass and horses. The heat from the animals below rose up, making it bearable. He made a nest of hay in the corner. He laid her down gently. She was shaking violently now, the shock setting in. "Here," Cole said. He took off his heavy duster and wrapped it around her. Then he took off his flannel overshirt and draped that over her too, leaving himself in his undershirt. He sat down in the hay, a few feet away from her. He leaned his back against a post, his gun resting on his knee. "Sleep. Lena, I will watch." Lena lay there, huddled in his clothes. They smelled like him, sweat, tobacco, and smoke. She looked at the roof beams above her. Everything was gone. Her shop, her fabric, her mother's locket, the money she had saved, her home. The reality of it crashed down on her. The cruelty of the town. The realization that they wanted her dead. A sob ripped its way out of her throat. Then another. She curled into a ball, weeping. It was a jagged, ugly sound. It was the sound of a spirit breaking. Cole sat rigid. Every sob felt like a knife in his gut. He wanted to go to her. He wanted to hold her, but he remembered his promise. "I won't touch you unless you ask." He clenched his fists in the hay. Lena cried until she had no breath left. Then, in the silence, she sat up. She looked small and broken in the darkness. "Cole," she whispered. "I am here. Please," she said. Her voice broke. "Please don't sit over there." Cole moved. He crawled through the hay and sat beside her. Lena threw herself at him. She didn't wait. She lunged into his arms, burying her face in his neck, gripping his shoulders with a strength born of desperation. Cole wrapped his arms around her. He held her tight, crushing her against him. He rocked her back and forth, resting his chin on her soot-stained hair. "I have nothing," she sobbed against his skin. "I am cursed. Cole, everyone who gets close to me, Thomas, the town, you, I ruin everything. I am marked." "Hush," Cole said, his voice fierce in her ear. "That is a lie. That is their lie. You are not cursed. You are just surrounded by men who hide their hatred behind a Bible. You are the victim here. Lena, not the sin. I don't want to be a victim," she cried. I want to feel like I am still alive." She pulled back slightly, looking up at him. In the gloom, her eyes were huge and dark. The fear was there. Yes, but beneath it was something else, a wildfire of need. A need to assert her existence against the void. She reached up and grabbed the back of his neck. She pulled his face down to hers. She kissed him. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was frantic. It was the taste of smoke and salt tears. It was a plea. "Make me feel real. Erase the fire. Erase the fear." Cole froze for a split second, stunned by the intensity of it. Then his own desire, held in check for months, roared to life. He kissed her back, his hand tangling in her hair, his mouth hard against hers. For a moment, they were just two desperate people trying to merge into one, trying to forget the world outside the loft. But then Cole felt the frantic trembling in her body. He tasted the hysteria on her lips. He pulled back. He broke the kiss, gently but firmly, taking her face in his hands and holding her still. "Lena, stop!" She tried to push forward again, a whimper escaping her throat. "No, please, don't stop! Stop!" Cole said again, resting his forehead against hers. He was breathing hard, his heart hammering against her chest. "I want you, Lena. God knows I want you. But not like this." Lena froze. Shame washed over her. "He is rejecting me, even now." "Not like this," Cole repeated, sensing her withdrawal. "Look at me." She opened her eyes. "You are scared, and you are hurting, and you just lost everything," Cole said, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones, wiping away the soot. "If we do this now, tonight, I become just another thing you used to survive. I become a crutch, or worse, I become a man who took advantage of a woman when she was on her knees. I need you," Lena whispered. "You have me." Cole swore. "You have all of me, but I won't let you use your body to pay for comfort. You are worth more than that. I am going to hold you, just hold you. And when the sun comes up, and you aren't afraid anymore, then you decide what you want." The words washed over Lena. He was refusing to exploit her vulnerability. He was refusing to let her diminish herself. The frantic energy drained out of her, leaving her limp. She slumped against him, her head on his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered into the dark. Cole wrapped his arms around her, pulling the heavy duster tight around her shoulders. He leaned his head back against the post, staring into the shadows, guarding her sleep. while the smell of smoke lingered in the air like a ghost. The blackened skeleton of the dressmaker's shop stood like a rotten tooth in the jaw of Red Hollow's main street. It was an ugly, jagged thing, smelling of wet ash and ruin. The wind, relentless as ever, whistled through the empty window frames, kicking up swirls of soot that coated the boardwalk and stung the eyes of passers-by. For 3 days, the wreckage had sat untouched. The town walked around it, giving it a wide berth. To the respectable citizens, the charred beams were a testament to God's judgment, a physical manifestation of the sin they believed had taken root in their community. To the others, the washerwomen, the section hands, the girls from the saloon, it was a tragedy they dared not mourn aloud, for fear the same fire might find their own doors. But on the 4th morning, the silence was broken by the sound of a hammer striking wood. Cole Maddox was working. He had stripped to his shirt sleeves despite the biting cold. He was hauling charred timber out of the debris, stacking it in a pile for burning, and salvaging what little lumber had survived the flames. He moved with a grim, mechanical determination, his breath pluming white in the air. He had no money for new lumber, and the local sawmill, owned by a cousin of the sheriff, had refused to sell to him. So he scavenged. He pulled scrap wood from the ravine behind the livery. He dragged abandoned fence posts from the edge of the scrubland. He was rebuilding, not because he had a plan, but because he refused to let the destruction have the final word. By noon, he was not alone. It started with Mr. O'Connor, the rancher whose barn had burned days before. He drove his buckboard up to the ruin, the bed of the wagon loaded with rough-hewn planks. He didn't say a word to Cole. He simply climbed down, grabbed a crowbar, and began prying up the ruined floorboards. Then came Mr. Miller, Millie's father, a man with a bad leg and a back bent from years of stony farming. He brought a bag of nails, bent and rusted, pulled from old crates, but usable. By mid-afternoon, 4 men were working in the shell of the shop. They spoke little. They kept their hats pulled low. They knew they were being watched. They worked with the desperate, quiet solidarity of men who understood that if they did not stand together, they would be picked off one by one. From the window of the sheriff's office across the street, Silas Kane watched the construction with eyes like chips of flint. "They are like cockroaches," Kane muttered. "Lighting a cigar, you step on them, and they just scurry back out of the cracks." Reverend Amos Clay stood beside him, his hands clasped behind his back. "It is defiance. Mr. Kane, pure and simple. They are building a monument to their own stubbornness. That shop was cleansed by fire. To rebuild it is to invite the devil back in. It is undermining my authority." Kane growled. "And yours. Reverend, if they think they can just put it back together, they will think they can resist the buyout offers. They will think they can stay." Clay nodded slowly. "The town is confused. They see the fire as judgment, but now they see the gunmen working to restore it. They do not know which way the wind blows. We must provide them with a compass." "Call a meeting," Kane said, turning from the window. "Tonight. Not a town council meeting." Clay corrected. "A spiritual assembly. In the church. We will frame this not as a matter of property, but as a matter of the soul. We will expose the rot so clearly that no one, not even O'Connor, will dare stand with them." The church hall was stifling. Every bench was packed, the air thick with the smell of damp wool, kerosene, and nervous sweat. The sheriff had gone door to door, strongly encouraging attendance. The implication was clear. Absence would be noted, and absence would be interpreted as loyalty to the wrong side. Lena sat in the very last pew, squeezed into the corner. She wore a borrowed dress from the livery owner's wife, a drab gray thing that hung loosely on her frame. She kept her head down, her hands gripping her elbows. She had not wanted to come. She felt raw, skinned alive, her grief over her home still a fresh, bleeding wound. But Cole had insisted, "If we hide, they win," he had told her, his eyes hard. "We go. We look them in the eye. We show them we are still standing." Cole stood against the back wall, a few feet from her. He had washed the soot from his face, but the shadows under his eyes were dark. His duster was brushed clean, and his hands rested loosely at his sides, near his hips. He was the only man in the room who had not removed his hat until the very last second, and he held it now like a shield. Reverend Clay stood at the pulpit. He looked tall and terrible in the lamplight, his shadow stretching long across the floorboards. "My flock," Clay began, his voice rolling out like thunder. "We gather tonight in a time of trial. Our town is besieged. We face drought. We face poverty. And now, we face fire." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "But the fire outside is merely a reflection of the fire within," he continued. "We are suffering because we have allowed moral decay to fester in Red Hollow. We have allowed the weeds of sin to choke the wheat of righteousness." He looked out over the crowd, his gaze sweeping past the nervous faces of the merchants and landing on the back of the room. "We have welcomed dangerous outsiders," Clay said, his voice sharpening. "Men of violence who carry death in their holsters, and we have tolerated women who loose their moorings, women who reject the guidance of the church and the natural authority of men." Lena felt the eyes of the town turn toward her. She shrank into herself, wishing the floor would open up and swallow her. "There are those who would rebuild what God has destroyed," Clay shouted, slamming his hand on the pulpit. "They try to raise up the den of iniquity from the ashes. They mock the judgment that was visited upon them." A murmur went through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, their faces hard with self-righteous fear. But then, a voice spoke up from the middle of the room. "She fixed my girl's coat." The room went deadly silent. "Mr." Miller stood up, twisting his hat in his hands. He looked terrified, but he remained standing. "Mrs. Hart," Miller stammered. "She fixed Millie's coat, and she didn't charge me a penny. She gave us bread when we had none. That don't sound like iniquity to me." "Reverend, sit down." "Miller?" someone hissed from the front row. "No, Mr." O'Connor stood up on the other side of the aisle. His face was red, his jaw set. "Miller is right. My barn burned down 3 days ago. Was that God's judgment too, Reverend? Or was that just someone trying to scare me into selling my land?" Silas Kane, sitting in the front pew, turned slowly. He fixed O'Connor with a stare that was cold enough to freeze water. "Be careful what you accuse people of." "O'Connor," Kane said smoothly. "Accidents happen when people are careless." "Careless?" O'Connor's voice rose. "My barn was soaked in kerosene, just like the dress shop." "Order," Reverend Clay bellowed. "Order in this house." He gripped the pulpit, his face flushing. "We are not here to discuss barns. We are here to discuss souls. You defend this woman. Mr. O'Connor, you defend a woman who is known to wander the alleys at night, a woman who invites the attention of hired killers. She is a widow trying to survive," Miller shouted. "She is a temptation." Clay roared back. "Let us speak the truth. Lena Hart came to this town with a shadow over her. Her first marriage. We all know the stories. A husband who had to discipline her. A husband who struggled to contain her willful nature." Lena gasped. The air left her lungs. "Some women invite such treatment," Clay said, his voice dropping to a poisonous whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "Some women have a spirit that cannot be tamed by kindness. They require a heavy hand. And when that hand is removed, they run wild. They lead men astray. They bring ruin upon themselves and everyone around them." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He was taking the worst years of her life, the beatings, the terror, the nights she prayed for death and twisting them into proof of her own wickedness. He was saying she deserved it. Lena began to shake. A high, keen sound was building in her throat. "That is enough." The voice cut through the room like a whip crack. Cole Maddox stepped away from the back wall. He walked down the center aisle, his boots loud on the floorboards. The crowd parted for him, shrinking away as if he were a wolf walking through a flock of sheep. He stopped 10 feet from the pulpit. He looked at Clay, and the contempt on his face was absolute. "You talk about sin," Cole said, his voice low and steady. "You talk about morality. But I have ridden with killers. Reverend, I have ridden with men who would burn a house down for $1. And none of them, not one of them, had a heart as black as yours." Kane stood up. Watch your mouth. Maddox, I am done watching, Cole said, not looking at him. I am done listening to you twist the Bible to cover up your greed. He turned to the crowd. I am a gunman, Cole announced. He spread his hands. I have done things that would make you sick. I have killed men. I have burned homesteads because I was following orders. I carry that weight every day. I don't hide from it. He pointed at Cain. But Silas Cain? He pays men to do it for him so he can keep his hands clean. And this man? He pointed at Clay. He blesses the fire and calls it God's will. He walked back toward Lena, extending his hand toward her but not touching her. And you attack her? Cole's voice rose, shaking with fury. A woman who has done nothing but work. A woman who sewed your clothes and fed your neighbors. You attack her because she is easy. Because she is alone. You blame her for the fire you set. Lies. Clay shouted. He is a liar and a blasphemer. The sheriff stood up, looking frantic. All right, now let's calm down. I will not calm down, Cole roared. He spun back to Clay. You stood there and watched her house burn. You watched her almost die. And now you stand there and say she invited it? That she invited her husband to beat her? He took a breath, his chest heaving. The true danger in this town isn't a woman trying to survive, Cole said, his voice dropping to a lethal quiet. It is men who use God and law to excuse their own cruelty. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. The townspeople looked from Cole to Clay to Cain. The veil had been torn. The comfortable lie that this was about morality was shredding. Clay's face was purple. He looked like he might have a stroke. For the good of the town, Clay sputtered, gripping the wood. For the good of the town, she must go, and you with her. This is a chance for redemption. Mr. Maddox, leave. Take her and go, before more accidents happen. It was a naked threat. Lena stood up. Her legs were shaking so hard she had to grab the back of the pew in front of her. She felt like she was going to vomit. But the anger was a hot, bright coal in her chest, burning away the shame. She stepped out into the aisle. She stood beside Cole. She didn't look at him. She looked at Reverend Clay. You told me to obey, she said. Her voice was small, trembling, but in the silence, it was clear. Clay blinked. Mrs. Hart, when I came to you, Lena said, her voice growing stronger. When I came to you with a bruised face and a broken lip. When I told you Thomas was hurting me, you told me to obey. You told me it was my duty. A gasp went through the women in the room. They looked at each other. They knew. Every woman there knew the fear of a heavy hand, and the silence the church demanded. I obeyed. Lena said, I let him break me. I let him use me. Because I thought I was sinful. I thought my pain was my penance. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the women who had shunned her. But I am not sinful for wanting to live. She said, I am not sinful for wanting to be safe, and I am not sinful for wanting to be loved without being hurt. She took a step forward. I sewed your dresses by lamplight until my fingers bled. She said to Mrs. Galloway, I fixed your husband's coat. She said to the baker's wife, I lived quietly. I asked for nothing. She turned back to Clay. Desire didn't ruin my life. Reverend, men like you did, men who think a woman is something to be owned, men who think that if they can't control us, they have to destroy us. She stood there, small and thin in her borrowed gray dress, but she looked like a giant. She had spoken the unspoken thing. She had named the monster. Some of the men looked down, ashamed. Some of the women wiped tears from their eyes. But Silas Cain did not look ashamed. He looked bored. Judd, Cain said quietly. Judd Mercer stepped out from the side of the room. He was a big man, heavy with muscle, wearing a gun belt that hung low on his hips. He had a face like a bulldog and eyes that gleamed with malice. That is a touching speech. Darlin', Judd drawled. He hooked his thumbs in his belt and looked at Cole, but words don't change what he is. Look at him, standing there like a hero. Judd laughed. I was there in Wyoming. Folks, Judd announced, I saw Cole Maddox put a bullet in a man's back. I saw him watch a woman burn. He's a tame dog now, maybe following the widow around, hoping for a scrap. But once a killer, always a killer. He took a step toward Cole. "Come on, Cole," Judd taunted. "You want to be the big man? You want to save her? Let's settle this right here in the house of the Lord. Show them who you really are." Cole went rigid. His hand twitched toward his gun. Lena saw the war in his face. She saw the violence rising, the old instinct to solve the problem with a bullet. If he killed Judd here, he would be a murderer in the eyes of the town. He would be exactly what they said he was. "Cole," Lena whispered. Cole looked at Judd. He saw the trap. He saw the eagerness in Cain's eyes. He unclenched his fist. He took a breath. "I am not that man anymore," Cole said, "and I am not going to let you turn me back into him." He turned to the crowd. "If you want us gone, you will have to say it to my face. Not through a preacher, not through a fire. You look me in the eye and tell me you stand with these men." No one spoke. The shame was too thick. Cole put his hand on Lena's shoulder. "Come on, we are done here." They turned and walked out. They walked past Cain, past Clay, past Judd, who was grinning like a wolf. They walked out of the church into the cold night air. Behind them, the meeting dissolved into chaos. Arguments broke out. The sheriff was shouting, but the lines had been drawn. They didn't stop walking until they reached the edge of town, where the land dropped away into the valley. They sat on a flat rock, looking out over the darkness. The wind had died down, leaving a crisp, freezing silence. The moon was full, painting the sagebrush in silver and blue. Lena was shaking. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her cold and hollow. "They are going to kill us," she whispered. "Maybe," Cole said. He was rolling a cigarette, his hand steady now, but not tonight. Cain miscalculated. He thought he could shame the town into running us out. "But you stopped him? Me?" Lena laughed bitterly. "I just told them the truth. It didn't change anything. They still hate me." "No," Cole said. He lit the cigarette, the flare of the match illuminating his face. "They don't hate you, they fear you, because you stood up." He took a drag and exhaled a plume of smoke. "We have to leave, Lena, soon, before Cain decides to stop playing with meetings and starts using bullets." "I know," Lena said. She wrapped her arms around her knees. She looked at him. He was looking out at the valley, his profile stark against the stars. "Cole," she said softly. He turned to her. "I am scared." She admitted, "Not of Cain. I am terrified of him. But that's not what I mean. What are you scared of?" "I am scared of this," she said, gesturing between them. "I am scared of loving you." Cole went still. "Because," Lena struggled for the words, "because all my life, wanting something has made me weak. It gave Thomas power over me. If I love you, if I let myself need you, I feel like I am handing you a weapon. I feel like I am opening my throat." She looked at him, tears stinging her eyes. "I feel that desire like an ache, Cole, like a physical pain, and I have always believed that pain was a warning, that it was God telling me I was wrong." Cole flicked the cigarette away. It arched through the dark like a falling star. He turned fully toward her. He took her hands. They were cold, but his were warm. "Lena, listen to me," he said. "Wanting me doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." He squeezed her hands. "You think you are handing me a weapon? You are handing me a reason to breathe. You are handing me something worth fighting my own demons for. That isn't weakness. That is the strongest thing there is." He leaned closer. "Thomas broke you down to make himself feel big," Cole said. "I don't want to break you. I want to build something with you. I want to stand beside you, not over you." The honesty in his voice was a physical weight. It crushed the last of her defenses. Lena looked at his mouth. She looked at the scar on his cheek. She saw the man who had pulled her from the fire, the man who had stood up to the whole town for her, the man who had slept in the hay beside her and never touched her because he respected her too much. She leaned in. This time, it wasn't frantic. It wasn't a desperate grab for safety. She closed the distance slowly. She paused, just an inch away, giving him time to pull back. giving herself time to be sure. It was a question. Are you sure? Cole didn't pull back. He leaned in the final inch. Their lips met. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was the meeting of two people who had been battered by the world and had found the only safe harbor left. It tasted of tobacco and cold air and profound relief. Cole's hand came up to cradle the back of her head. Lena's hand rested on his chest, over his heart. She could feel it beating, steady, strong, rhythmic. They kissed until the cold was forgotten. They kissed until the fear of the morning was pushed back to the edges of their minds. When they broke apart, Lena rested her forehead against his. She felt raw, exposed, but also steadier. The ache was still there, but it didn't feel like a wound anymore. It felt like a root, digging deep into the earth, holding her fast. "I am with you," she whispered. "Wherever we go, I am with you," Cole answered. They sat there for a long time, holding on to each other in the dark, while the wind picked up again, whispering through the sagebrush. Back in the town, the lights in the sheriff's office had gone out, but in the back room of the saloon, a single lamp burned. Silas Kane paced the floor. He was furious. The meeting had been a disaster. Instead of isolating them, he had turned them into martyrs. He had seen the look on the faces of the townsfolk, the doubt, the shame. If that doubt spread, his takeover was finished. Judd Mercer sat at the table, cleaning his nails with a knife. It didn't work. "Silas," Judd said, "the preacher's words don't hold water when the woman starts crying about her sewing." "I know," Kane snapped. He poured himself a drink, his hands shaking with rage. "I gave them a chance. I tried to do this cleanly." "Clean is expensive," Judd noted. "And slow." Kane downed the drink. He slammed the glass onto the table. "Finish it," Kane said. Judd looked up, a slow smile spreading across his bulldog face. "Tonight?" "No," Kane said. "They will be expecting it tonight. Let them stew. Let them try to leave." He leaned over the table, his eyes dead and cold. "The cattle drive starts next week. I want them gone before the first steer moves. I don't care how you do it. Robbery gone wrong, a lover's quarrel, a fire that they didn't wake up from. Just put them in the ground." "Judd," Judd sheathed his knife. "Consider it done." "Boss." He blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. The dawn did not break over Red Hollow so much as it bruised the horizon. The sky to the east was a swollen, angry purple, bleeding into a heavy gray that pressed down on the valley floor. There was no dew on the sagebrush this morning, only a dry, static electricity that made the hair on a man's arms stand up. The wind had shifted during the night. It was no longer the biting cold gust of winter, but a hot, restless breath coming up from the southern deserts, carrying the taste of copper and ancient dust. The horses in the livery stable were stomping in their stalls, rolling their eyes at the shadows. Even the land seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the violence that had been simmering in the town to finally boil over. Lena Hart stood on the small rise behind the livery stable, looking out at the vast, intimidating expanse of the territory. She wore a heavy coat Cole had bartered for, and her hair was tied back severely, stripping her face of any softness. She looked like a woman who had weathered a siege. Cole stood beside her. He was checking the cinch on the bay gelding, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped and looked at the sky. "It is going to be a bad one," Cole said quietly. "The air is too heavy." "Let it come," Lena replied. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the distant line of the mountains. "I am ready to go, Cole. I have nothing left here but ash and bad memories." They had made the decision in the gray hours before sunrise. They would leave Red Hollow, not as fugitives running in the night, but as people choosing a different life. Cole knew a valley 3 days' ride to the north, a place called Silver Creek, where the water ran clear over white stones and the soil was deep and black, not this unforgiving alkali dust. "We will build a cabin," Cole had told her, his voice rough with hope. "Not in town. Up on the slope where you can see the sunrise, and no one there will know your name unless you tell them. No one will know about Thomas. No one will know about the fire." It sounded like a dream. But standing here in the strange, hot wind, Lena dared to believe it. Cole finished saddling the horses. He turned to her, taking off his hat and running a hand through his hair. "We ride out at noon," he said, "but before we go, I have to finish this." Lena stiffened. She turned to him, panic flaring in her chest. "No," she said, "Cole, we can just leave. We can ride out now. If you go to them, if you go to Cain, if I don't go, they will hunt us." Cole interrupted gently. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Silas Cain is a man who thinks he owns the world. If we just disappear, he will take it as an insult. He will send Judd and the others after us, and I will spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering when a bullet is going to find you." He reached out and took her hands. His palms were rough, calloused from the work of rebuilding her shop, but his grip was warm. "I have to look him in the eye. Lena, I have to make him understand that the cost of following us is higher than he wants to pay. I am not going to fight him if I don't have to. I am going to negotiate." "Negotiate?" Lena laughed. "A brittle sound. You don't negotiate with a rattlesnake." "Cole, you kill it or you run from it." "I am not killing anyone today unless they give me no choice," Cole said. "I am going unarmed." Lena pulled her hands away, horror washing over her. "Unarmed? You are walking into a camp of hired guns without a weapon? That is suicide." "It is a show of good faith," Cole argued, though his eyes were hard. "If I walk in there with a gun tied down, the shooting starts before I open my mouth. I need to talk to Cain. I need to talk to the sheriff. I need to end this here, in Red Hollow, so we don't carry it with us." He saw the terror in her face, the way her lip trembled. He stepped in and did something he rarely did in the open. He cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "I will come back," he promised. "You don't know that," Lena whispered. She gripped his wrists, her fingers digging into his skin. "I can't fight this anymore. Cole, I can't fight the way I feel. Every time you walk away, I feel like the ground is opening up under me. I am so afraid I will never see you again." Cole looked at her with a fierce, burning intensity. He brushed his thumb over her lower lip, a lingering, possessive touch that made her breath hitch. "You will see me," he said. "I have too much to live for now to let a man like Cain put me in the ground." He leaned down and kissed her forehead. It was a seal, a vow. Then he turned, grabbed the reins of his horse, and swung into the saddle. He didn't look back as he rode toward the edge of town, toward the cluster of white canvas tents where Silas Cain had set up his court. Lena watched him go until he was swallowed by the dust that was beginning to rise from the road. She hugged her arms around herself, trying to stop the shaking. "Miss Lena?" She turned. Millie Miller was standing at the corner of the livery, clutching her shawl against the wind. The little girl's eyes were red, her face streaked with dirt. "Millie," Lena said, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "I heard you were leaving," Millie said, her voice wobbling. "Papa said the bad men burned your shop so you couldn't stay." Lena walked over and knelt in the dirt, heedless of her skirt. She took the girl's small hands. "We are going to find a new place, Millie, a place where it is safe. But I am not leaving because of the bad men. I am leaving because I want to be happy." Millie sniffed and reached into her pocket. She pulled out a small, rough doll made of corn husks and scrap fabric Lena had given her months ago. "I want you to have Sarah," Millie said, thrusting the doll at Lena, "so you don't get lonely on the trail." Lena took the doll. Her throat tightened so painfully she couldn't speak. This small, battered toy was more precious than all the silk in Boston. It was proof that in this hard, hateful town, she had planted a seed of love that had actually grown. "Thank you, Millie," Lena whispered. "I will keep her safe." She stood up, clutching the doll. This was what she was leaving behind, the few innocent hearts that beat in Red Hollow. But she knew she had to go. She refused to be a martyr anymore. She refused to be the town's lesson in morality. She was going to live. The camp of Silas Cain sat on a bluff overlooking the town. a collection of military-style tents arranged with precise order. The wind whipped the canvas, making it snap like gunshots. Cole rode into the center of the camp. He kept his hands high, holding the reins loosely, showing his empty waist. He saw men emerge from the tents, rifles in hand. He recognized faces from the old days, men with cold eyes and no conscience. They watched him, but no one fired. He dismounted in front of the largest tent. "Silas!" Cole shouted over the wind. "I am here to talk." The flap of the tent opened. Silas Kane emerged, holding a cup of coffee. He was followed by Reverend Amos Clay, who looked pale and nervous in the blustery wind, and Judd Mercer, who was grinning like a wolf who had cornered a rabbit. "Well, look at this," Kane said, his voice carrying easily, "The prodigal son returns, and without his iron, you have gotten trusting in your old age." "Cole, I am not here to fight," Cole said, standing his ground as Judd and two other men circled behind him. "I am leaving. Lena and I are riding out today." "Running away?" Judd taunted. "That is what I figured. Once a coward, always a coward." Cole ignored him. He kept his eyes on Kane. "I am telling you this so you don't waste your time sending men after us." Cole said, "We're done with Red Hollow. You can have the town. You can have the valley. But you leave us be. And you leave the small ranchers alone." Kane laughed, taking a sip of his coffee. "You are in no position to make demands." "Cole, you are standing in the middle of my camp, unarmed, telling me what I can do with my own property? I am telling you that if you come after us—" "I stop being the man who wants to talk," Cole said. His voice dropped, becoming flat and deadly. "And I become the man you remember from Wyoming. You know what that man can do. Silas, you know I will burn your whole empire down to get to you." Kane's smile faltered for a second. He remembered. He remembered that Cole Maddox had been the most efficient, ruthless killer on his payroll until he grew a conscience. Reverend Clay stepped forward, clutching his Bible. "This is a perversion." Clay spat. "You choose a ruined woman over your own kind? You choose a whore over order? Don't you call her that," Cole warned, his fists clenching at his sides. "She is what she is," Clay insisted, his voice rising shrilly. "She is a vessel of sin. She has corrupted this town. She is a better person than you will ever be." Cole shot back. Kane shook his head, looking disappointed. "It is sad. Cole, really, you are throwing your life away for a skirt, a woman who was broken by another man before you ever got there. You think she loves you? She is just looking for a shield." Cole took a step forward. "I am done talking. I came to give you a warning. Stay away from us." Judd Mercer laughed. He stepped in close to Cole, invading his space. He smelled of stale whiskey and violence. "You think you can just walk away?" Judd sneered. "After the trouble you caused? After you embarrassed the boss in front of the whole town?" He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I enjoyed that fire. Cole, watching her shop burn, I lit the match myself. It was pretty, seeing all that silk go up. I could hear her screaming inside. It was music. The world went red. The restraint Cole had held on to for years, the leash he had put on his own violence, snapped. It didn't fray. It broke. He didn't think. He didn't calculate." Cole roared, a sound of pure animal fury. He drove his forehead into the bridge of Judd's nose with a sickening crunch. Blood sprayed. Judd stumbled back, howling. Cole didn't stop. He lunged, grabbing the front of Judd's coat and driving a fist into his gut, then another into his jaw. The two men crashed into the side of the tent, tearing the canvas. "Kill him!" Kane shouted, dropping his coffee. The camp erupted. Cole spun, using Judd's staggering body as a shield as one of the guards fired. The bullet hit Judd in the shoulder. Cole shoved the screaming man into the guard and dove for the weapon. It was chaos. Fists, boots, the butt of a rifle. Cole was a whirlwind of rage. He wasn't fighting for land or money anymore. He was fighting for the woman who had screamed in the fire, in the town below. The sound of the gunshot cracked through the air. Lena heard it. She was standing by her horse, tying the saddlebags. Her head snapped up. Cole. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think about safety. She didn't think about the fact that she was a dressmaker, not a fighter. She vaulted onto her horse, gathered her skirts, and kicked the animal into a gallop. She rode toward the sound of the gunfire, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She would not lose him. Not now. Not when they were so close. As she rode up the incline toward the bluff, the sky finally broke. The wind roared, a deafening sound like a freight train. A wall of brown dust, hundreds of feet high, swept over the ridge and swallowed the sun. The light vanished, replaced by a choking, copper-colored twilight. The sandstorm hit with the force of a physical blow. Grit scoured Lena's skin, blinded the horse, and turned the world into a swirling confusion of brown shapes. She couldn't see the camp. She could only hear the shouting and the popping of gunfire, muffled by the wind. "Cole!" she screamed, but the wind tore the name from her lips. She slid from her horse, which was rearing in panic, and ran forward on foot. She stumbled over rocks, shielding her eyes with her arm. She saw shapes looming in the dust. Men running, a horse galloping past, riderless. Then a hand grabbed her arm. It was a grip like a steel trap. Lena spun around, gasping. Judd Mercer loomed out of the dust. His face was a mask of blood from his broken nose, his eyes wild and glazed with pain and madness. He was holding a knife in his other hand. "You!" Judd screamed over the wind. "You did this!" He yanked her toward him. Lena stumbled, falling to her knees in the dirt. "You witch!" Judd spat, blood flying from his mouth. "Driving men crazy, making good men turn against each other. I should have finished you in the alley." He raised the knife. Lena looked at the blade. She saw her death, and something inside her refused to accept it. She remembered the years of submission. She remembered Thomas. She remembered the fire. She remembered the feeling of helplessness. No, she didn't freeze. She didn't beg. As Judd lunged, Lena threw herself forward. Not away, she scooped up a handful of sand and rocks and flung it directly into his eyes. Judd howled, blindingly momentarily. Lena scrambled up. She kicked him, hard, in the knee. He staggered. She clawed at his face, her nails digging into his skin, screaming with a feral, terrified rage. She was fighting for her life, for her future, for Cole. "You won't touch me," she screamed. Judd, blind and enraged, lashed out with the knife, slashing the sleeve of her coat. He grabbed her hair, yanking her head back. "I will cut your throat," he roared. "Lena!" The voice cut through the storm. Cole emerged from the brown haze like a phantom. He was battered, his shirt torn, blood streaming from a cut on his temple. But when he saw Judd holding Lena, his face went completely blank. He didn't shout. He didn't pause. He hit Judd with the force of a falling boulder. The two men slammed into the dirt, rolling toward the edge of the bluff where the rock dropped away into the ravine below. The knife flew from Judd's hand. They grappled in the dust, a tangle of limbs and grunts. Judd thumbed for Cole's eyes. Cole headbutted him again, sensing the drop behind them. Lena scrambled to her feet. She looked around for a weapon. She saw a heavy rock. She ran toward them. The wind was howling so loud she couldn't hear her own breathing. Cole was on top, but Judd bucked him off, rolling them so Cole's head hung over the precipice. Judd's hands were around Cole's throat, squeezing. Lena didn't hesitate. She rushed forward. She didn't just hit him. She threw her entire body weight into the attack. She grabbed Judd's arm, the one pinning Cole, and yanked it back with all her strength. It broke Judd's balance. Cole surged up, driving his knee into Judd's chest. He shoved him. Judd flailed. His boots slipped on the loose gravel of the edge. He grabbed for purchase, his eyes meeting Lena's for one split second. He looked surprised. Then he was gone. He disappeared into the swirling dust below. There was no scream, just the sound of the wind. Cole rolled away from the edge, gasping for air. He looked at Lena. She was standing over him, chest heaving, her hair wild, blood on her hands, Judd's blood. She looked terrified, but she also looked magnificent. Cole scrambled up and pulled her into his arms. They clung to each other in the middle of the storm, shaking, while the sand whipped around them. "It is over," Cole rasped. "It is over," but it wasn't quite over. Through the dust, two figures approached. Silas Kane walked forward, holding a revolver. He was limping, his fine coat torn. Behind him, Reverend Clay stood, clutching his Bible, looking around with wide, frightened eyes. Kane raised the gun, aiming it at Cole and Lena. "You just don't die, do you, Maddox?" Kane shouted. He cocked the hammer. Cole pushed Lena behind him. He had no weapon. He stared down the barrel of the gun, bracing himself. "Drop it, Silas!" The voice came from the side. Sheriff Vance stepped out of the dust. He looked terrified. He was sweating despite the wind, but his gun was drawn, and it was pointed at Kane. "Get out of the way!" "Vance!" Kane snarled, not looking at him. "I said drop it!" Vance screamed, his voice cracking. "I'm the law in this town, not you. I am done cleaning up your messes." Kane turned, sneering. "You don't have the guts." Vance pulled the trigger. The shot was loud, flat. Kane jerked. He looked down at his chest, where a red blossom was spreading on his white shirt. He looked shocked. He looked at Vance, then at Cole, his mouth opening and closing. He crumpled to his knees, then fell face forward into the dirt. The dust began to cover him almost immediately. Reverend Clay stared at the body. He looked at the sheriff. He looked at the townspeople who were beginning to emerge from the haze, drawn by the final shot. "He is dead!" Clay shrieked. "You killed him! You have brought damnation on us all! This is God's wrath!" He pointed a shaking finger at Lena. "It is her! The witch! She brought this!" "Shut up! Amos! It was Mrs. Galloway, the banker's wife! She walked out of the dust, holding a shawl over her mouth." She looked at Kane's body, then at Lena and Cole, huddled together and bleeding. "Just shut up," she said tiredly. "We are tired of listening to you." Clay looked around. He saw the faces of his flock. They weren't looking at him with reverence anymore. They were looking at him with exhaustion and disgust. They saw a man screaming at a battered woman while a tyrant lay dead in the dirt. Clay lowered his hand. He stepped back, shrinking. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the storm. A small, black figure swallowed by the land he had tried to control. The storm broke as quickly as it had come. The wind died down, leaving the air heavy with dust, but still. Lena and Cole stood in the clearing light. They were a wreck. Their clothes were torn, their faces masked in blood and grit. Lena was leaning heavily against Cole, her legs trembling, but she was standing. The sheriff holstered his gun. He looked at Kane's body, then at Cole. "I will write it up as self-defense," Vance said, his voice hollow. "For Judd, and for this." Cole nodded. "Thank you. Sheriff," Vance looked at Lena. "I'm sorry. Mrs. Hart, for everything." Lena straightened up. She wiped the blood from her cheek. She looked at the small crowd that had gathered, Millie's parents, the O'Connors, the shopkeepers. "We are leaving," Lena said. Her voice was rough, scarred by the smoke and the screaming. But it was steady. "We are not leaving because we are guilty," she said. "And we are not leaving because we are afraid. We are leaving because we are done living in a place where fear is called morality." She looked at Cole. He looked back at her with a look of pure awe. He saw the bruises, the dirt, the exhaustion, and he thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. She was iron. She was fire. "Let's go home," Cole said softly. They walked to their horses. Cole helped Lena into the saddle, then mounted his own. As they turned to ride out, Millie broke away from her mother and ran forward. "Miss Lena!" Lena stopped. Millie reached up and grabbed Lena's boot. "Don't forget us," Millie whispered. "Never," Lena said, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. She touched the pocket where the corn-husk doll sat. They turned their horses toward the north. They rode past the dead body of the cattle baron, past the silent preacher, past the town that had tried to break them. They rode out of Red Hollow and didn't look back. That night, they made camp in a small, abandoned trapper's cabin halfway up the foothills. The air here was thin and cold, biting with the scent of pine. The sky was a vast, inverted bowl of obsidian. pierced by stars so bright they looked like white fire. Inside the cabin, Cole had built a fire in the stone hearth. The light danced on the rough log walls. They had washed the blood and dust from their skin with melted snow. They were exhausted, their bodies aching, bruised in a dozen places. Lena sat on the blanket in front of the fire. She was wearing one of Cole's spare shirts. She stared at the flames. "It is quiet," she whispered. Cole sat down behind her. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her back against his chest. "It is over. Lena. No one is coming." Lena leaned her head back against his shoulder. She closed her eyes. For the first time in years, the knot of fear in her stomach, the knot that had been there since her wedding day, began to loosen. She turned in his arms. She looked at his face, tracing the line of his scar with her finger. "I was so afraid," she admitted. "When Judd had me, I thought I was going to die. But then I felt this anger, and I realized I wasn't fighting because I was scared of dying. I was fighting because I wanted to be with you." Cole kissed her palm. "You saved me. Lena, on that cliff, you saved my life. We saved each other," she whispered. She looked into his eyes. The hesitation was gone. The shame that Reverend Clay had planted in her heart was gone, burned away by the storm. "I can't fight it anymore." "Cole," she said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with emotion. "I don't want to fight it. Loving you, wanting you, it doesn't feel like death anymore. It feels like the only thing that has ever been truly alive." She pulled him closer. "I choose you, Cole. I choose this." Cole didn't respond with a shout of triumph. He didn't grab her. He looked at her with a reverence that stopped her heart. "And I choose you, Lena Hart, every day, for the rest of my life." He kissed her, and in the quiet of the cabin, with the mountains standing guard outside, they finally surrendered. It was a union of two broken people who had found that their jagged edges fit together perfectly. It was intense, consuming, and deeply, profoundly safe. Morning came with a slant of pale yellow sunlight across the rough floorboards. Lena woke to the smell of coffee. She stretched, her body aching from the fight, but her spirit feeling light, unburdened. She sat up. Cole was tending the fire, humming a low, tuneless song. He looked over at her and smiled, a real smile, one that reached his eyes. "Morning," he said, "morning." She stood up and walked to him. He wrapped an arm around her waist. They walked to the door of the cabin and opened it. The world outside was vast. The valley below was hidden in shadow, but the peaks above were bathed in gold. The air was cold and clean, filling their lungs with the promise of a new start. "Silver Creek is that way," Cole said, pointing north, 2 days' ride. Lena looked at the horizon. It was wild. It was dangerous. There would be wolves, and winter, and hard work. But she wasn't afraid. She took Cole's hand, his fingers interlaced with hers, strong and steady. "I am ready," she said. They stepped out into the cold mountain air, hand in hand, leaving the ghosts behind them. Their love wouldn't fix the world. The world was still hard, still unfair, but it gave them a place to stand. It gave them a home inside the storm. And as they walked toward the horses, the wind that brushed their faces didn't feel like a threat anymore. It felt like freedom. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Lena and Cole. If this story resonated with you, I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below and tell me where you are listening from. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you want to hear more tales of the American frontier, stories of grit, survival, and love in the Wild West, please subscribe to From Wild West. Share your thoughts in English in the comments. Did you like the ending? What would you like to hear next? Thank you for your support, and I will see you on the next trail.